Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The air tasted like salt and something else. Something metallic that clung to the back of my throat as the gray clouds pressed lower over the South Carolina coast. I'd been walking for 20 minutes, maybe 30, and the familiar landmarks of our camping section had dissolved into an identical sprawl of white trailers and picnic tables. The playground equipment loomed behind me like skeletal fingers against the darkening sky, and I realized with a cold certainty that I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere between the restrooms and what I thought was the main path. The camping resort stretched for miles along the coastline, a labyrinth of narrow roads designed to confuse. Each section looked exactly like the last. Same gravel driveways, same weathered vinyl siding, same potted plants wilting in the humidity. My parents were probably setting up dinner, wondering where I'd wandered off to. I was 19, old enough to navigate a camping ground, yet here I was, lost like a child in the gathering dusk. The wind picked up, carrying voices from somewhere beyond the tree line. Laughter, muffled and distant. I followed it, hoping it would lead me to someone who could point me toward Lot 47B. The gravel crunched beneath my sneakers, each step echoing in the strange emptiness that settles over places like this once the sun begins to set. Most families had retreated into their mobile homes, yellow light glowing behind curtained windows, and I felt acutely aware of how exposed I was on the open road. The voices grew louder, and I found myself approaching the boat ramp, a concrete slope disappearing into the dark water of the inlet. A group of 4 men stood clustered near a pickup truck, their conversation pausing as I approached. The light from a nearby lamppost cast their faces in harsh shadows, making it difficult to read their expressions. One of them, wearing a baseball cap pulled low, nudged the others and turned toward me with what might have been a smile. I asked about Section 47, trying to keep my voice steady, casual. The man in the cap studied me for a moment too long before gesturing vaguely toward the north. His directions were complicated, full of turns and landmarks I didn't recognize. The other men had gone quiet, watching. One of them leaned against the truck bed, his arms crossed, saying nothing at all. Then the man in the cap offered me a ride, said it was too far to walk in the dark, that the section numbers got all mixed up once you crossed the main access road. His sedan was parked just up the slope, he said. Wouldn't take but 5 minutes. The other men exchanged glances I couldn't interpret. The reasonable part of my mind said to decline politely, but another part, the part that had been walking alone in the growing darkness, that had felt the weight of being lost in an unfamiliar place, said it would be fine. Just a short ride. Back to my trailer. I got in. The interior smelled of stale cigarettes and air freshener that couldn't quite mask something else underneath. Something organic and unpleasant. The man drove in silence at first, his hands loose on the steering wheel, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror more than the road ahead. I tried to track our route, but the narrow roads all looked the same in the darkness, and the street lamps were few and far between. We passed the entrance to Section 47. I saw the sign clearly, the blue and white marker illuminated in the headlights. I started to mention it, but he kept driving, turning instead down a road that led deeper into the resort, away from the areas I recognized. My stomach tightened. I told him he'd missed the turn. He nodded, said something about a shortcut, about how the sections looped back on themselves in confusing ways. His voice was pleasant enough, but there was an undertone to it, something performative, as if he were following a script. We drove for another 3 minutes. Then he passed the Section 47 entrance again, this time from a different angle, but unmistakable. The same blue and white sign, the same cluster of trailers visible beyond the entrance gate. I felt something cold spread through my chest. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't someone unfamiliar with the layout. This was deliberate. He began talking then, filling the silence with observations about the camping ground, about how easy it was to get turned around at night, about how many people came here alone. His words felt like they were probing for something, testing my reactions. I kept my eyes forward, watching for landmarks. for anything familiar. The roads had grown darker, the trailers more spread out. We were heading toward the back sections, the ones that bordered the marshland where the lights didn't reach. At a stop sign near the southern perimeter, I made my decision. I told him I felt sick, that the winding roads were making me nauseous. I needed air, right now. My hand was already on the door handle before he could respond. The moment the car stopped, I pushed the door open and stumbled out onto the gravel, making a show of bending over as if I might throw up. He said something from inside the car, I couldn't hear what, and then the engine idled for several long seconds before he drove away, the taillights disappearing around a bend. I crouched behind a security golf cart parked near the intersection, my heart hammering against my ribs. The night pressed in around me, thick with the sound of crickets and the distant rush of the ocean. I waited there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes, listening for the sound of his car returning. When I finally stood and began walking back toward what I hoped was the main section, my legs felt unsteady. My perception sharpened to every shadow, every movement in my peripheral vision. I found my way back to lot 47B just before 9 o'clock. My parents barely looked up from their card game, asking only if I'd had a nice walk. I told them yes, that I just wandered farther than intended. That night, I lay awake in the narrow bunk, listening to the sounds of the camping ground settling around us. Doors closing, voices murmuring, cars passing on the gravel roads. Every set of headlights that swept across our windows made my breath catch. The next day I tried to forget about it, tried to convince myself it had been a misunderstanding, that the man had genuinely been confused about the layout. But the feeling persisted, a crawling awareness at the base of my skull, like static on a radio that wouldn't quite tune out. I saw him again on the third day. He was standing near the camp store, talking to another man I didn't recognize. They weren't doing anything suspicious, just two people having a conversation. But when I walked past, his eyes followed me with that same unreadable expression from the boat ramp. He didn't acknowledge me, didn't wave or nod, just watched. I kept walking, my skin prickling with the sensation of being tracked. That afternoon, the resort manager stopped by our site to collect some paperwork my father had forgotten to file. He was a weathered man in his 60s, the kind who'd probably managed places like this for decades. As he was leaving, he paused and looked at me, then at my parents, then back at me. "You been keeping close to your lot?" he asked, his voice casual, but his eyes serious. I nodded, unsure what he meant. He glanced around as if checking who might overhear, then lowered his voice. "That crew down by the boat ramp, they've been hanging around for about a week now. Had some complaints from folks about them. Lingering. Approaching people who are out walking alone." He cleared his throat. "Just saying, might be smart to stick to the main paths after dark. Travel in groups if you can." My parents looked confused, but I felt something cold settle in my stomach. The manager didn't elaborate. He just touched the brim of his cap and walked back toward his golf cart, leaving us with that vague warning hanging in the humid air. After that, I started noticing them everywhere, or I thought I did. The man in the baseball cap appeared at the beach access point one morning, standing far down the shore, facing in my direction. When I looked again a minute later, he was gone. I saw the sedan, or one exactly like it, parked in different sections of the camping ground, always far enough away that I couldn't be certain it was the same vehicle. Twice I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps on gravel outside our trailer, circling slowly, pausing at our windows. When I looked out, I saw nothing but shadows and the distant glow of security lights. My parents said I was being paranoid, that I'd let one awkward encounter spiral into irrational fear. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was seeing patterns where none existed, connecting dots that shouldn't be connected. But the feeling persisted, the sensation of being watched, of being marked somehow, as if that ride in the sedan had designated me for something, had put me on some list I couldn't see. I began mapping the camping ground obsessively. I memorized every exit route, every lit path, every security station. I counted the steps between our trailer and the nearest main road. I timed how long it would take to reach other occupied lots if I needed to run. My parents watched me with growing concern, suggesting maybe we should cut the trip short, head home early. But I refused. Leaving felt like admitting defeat, like confirming that I was losing my grip on reality. On our last night at the resort, I went for a walk despite my father's protests. I needed to prove to myself that I could, that I wouldn't be controlled by fear and paranoia. The air was thick with moisture, a storm building somewhere over the ocean, and the wind carried that same metallic taste I'd noticed that first night. I stuck to the main paths, staying within sight of the lit areas, but as I passed the boat ramp, I saw them. The same group, the same truck, the man in the baseball cap and 3 others, standing in a tight circle as if in conference. They didn't see me at first, and I had a clear view of them in the lamplight. One of them was holding something, a folder maybe, or a notebook. He was showing it to the others, pointing at something on the page. They looked intent, focused, like people working through a plan. Then the man in the cap looked up and saw me. Our eyes met across the distance, and for a moment, neither of us moved. His expression didn't change, didn't register surprise or recognition or guilt. He just looked at me with that same flat, assessing gaze I'd seen in the car, as if I were an object rather than a person, as if he were calculating something. I turned and walked away, forcing myself not to run. Behind me I heard their voices resume, low and conversational. No one followed. No one called out. But the feeling that had been building for days crystallized into certainty. This wasn't paranoia. Something was happening here. Something that existed just beneath the surface of the mundane camping ground life. And I had somehow become aware of it. Back at our trailer, I locked the door and wedged a chair under the handle. My parents were already asleep, oblivious. I sat at the small dinette table, staring out the window at the darkness beyond, watching for movement. Hours passed. The storm never came. The night remained still and oppressive, the air heavy with waiting. Just before dawn, I saw headlights approaching slowly along our section road. The sedan. It rolled past our trailer at a crawl, and in the brief moment when the headlights illuminated our windows, I saw him clearly in the driver's seat. The man in the baseball cap. He was looking directly at our trailer, his face expressionless, his eyes moving systematically from window to window, as if memorizing the layout. Then he was gone, and the darkness rushed back in. We left the next morning. I never told my parents about that final sighting. What would I say? That a man had driven past our trailer? That I'd seen him looking? It sounded absurd even in my own mind. But as we pulled out of the camping ground and merged onto the highway heading north, I found myself checking the rearview mirror compulsively, watching for a sedan that might be following us. It's been 3 years since that week on the South Carolina coast. I still think about it sometimes. About that ride, about those men at the boat ramp, about the manager's cryptic warning. I've tried to research what might have been happening there, but I've found nothing concrete. No news stories about the resort, no reports of anything sinister, just my memories and that persistent feeling that I'd glimpsed something I wasn't supposed to see. But here's what haunts me most. Last month I received a piece of mail at my college apartment. No return address. Inside was a single photograph, slightly out of focus, taken from a distance. It showed a young man walking alone on a gravel road at dusk, flanked by white trailers. The location was unmistakable. Section 47, the South Carolina camping ground. The person in the photo had their back to the camera, but I recognized the jacket I'd been wearing that week. Recognized my own posture, my own gait. Someone had been photographing me. The photo came with no note, no explanation, just that single image. Proof that I'd been watched even more closely than I'd feared. Proof that whatever I'd stumbled into wasn't finished with me yet. I keep the photograph in my desk drawer now, though I've thought about burning it 1,000 times. Sometimes I take it out and study it, trying to see if there are any details I've missed, any clue about who took it or why. But the image reveals nothing except my own oblivious figure walking alone in the fading light, unaware of the lens trained on my back. And I find myself wondering, if they took one photograph, how many others are there? How long were they watching? How many times did I pass within feet of someone documenting my movements, cataloging my routines? More importantly, why did they send it to me now, 3 years later? What does it mean that they've kept track of where I live, that they know how to find me even hundreds of miles from that coastal camping ground? I don't go for walks alone anymore. I map my exits everywhere I go. Classrooms, grocery stores, my own apartment building. I check my rearview mirror constantly. I've learned to recognize the signs of being followed, the subtle patterns of surveillance. People tell me I'm being paranoid, that I'm letting one bad experience warp my perception of the world. Maybe they're right. Or maybe I'm the only one who sees clearly now. Maybe I'm the only one who understands that there are people who circulate through places like that camping ground, identifying, documenting, collecting information about those of us who make ourselves vulnerable by being alone. Maybe the photograph was a message. We're still watching. We know where you are. We're patient. Last week, I saw a sedan identical to the one from that night parked outside my apartment complex. Same make, same model, same color. It was there for 3 days before disappearing. I never saw who was driving it, but I knew it was a message, a reminder. Sometimes I wonder if I should have just stayed in that car. Let it take me wherever it was going. At least then I would know what they wanted, what I'd avoided. The not knowing is worse than any concrete fear could be. It's the uncertainty that corrodes everything. The constant question of what's real and what's paranoia, what's coincidence and what's design. Tonight I'll wedge a chair under my apartment door and sit at my desk, staring out at the parking lot below. I'll watch for headlights that slow as they pass, for figures that linger too long in the shadows. I'll listen for footsteps in the hallway that pause outside my door, and I'll try to convince myself that I'm safe, that the distance and time have protected me, that the photograph was just a final gesture, a closing of a chapter. But deep down, I know better. They're still out there, and they're still watching. And someday, eventually, they'll come back to finish whatever they started that night on the boat ramp, when I made the mistake of being lost and alone and visible. The only question is, will I see them coming, or will I just disappear like all the others I suspect came before me? The ones who weren't careful enough, weren't paranoid enough, didn't learn to map their exits in time. I keep telling myself that awareness is protection, that vigilance will save me. But the photograph suggests otherwise. It suggests they like the chase. Story 2. The fog came down like a burial shroud over Thornwood Lake that October evening, so thick I could taste it, metallic and cold, coating my throat with each breath. I'd been at the corporate retreat for 2 days already, enduring the usual team-building nonsense, but that night felt different. The air itself seemed weighted, pressing against my chest as if the mountain was holding its breath. Whitlock had suggested the Courage Tour with that practiced enthusiasm of his, the kind that always made me wonder what he was compensating for. Reeves and Galloway agreed immediately, their laughter too loud in the lodge's main room, bouncing off the log walls like they were trying to convince themselves they weren't nervous. I should have said no. I should have stayed by the fire with my whiskey and let them play their games without me. But I went. We set out just after 9, when the last traces of twilight had bled from the sky and the fog had settled into something almost solid. My flashlight beam died about 3 feet ahead of us, swallowed by that gray-white wall. It looked like smoke from a cigarette, curling and reforming, never quite the same shape twice. The wooden planks of the path down to the lake groaned under our feet, swollen with moisture, and somewhere in the darkness a loon called out, a sound like drowning laughter. Whitlock led the way, his beam cutting through the mist in sharp, jerky movements. He kept up a steady stream of commentary about the lake's history, the fishing records, the depth of the water in winter. I barely heard him. My attention had narrowed to the sounds around us, the wet slap of our shoes on the wood, the whisper of fabric against fabric, the way the fog seemed to muffle everything except our breathing. It was as if we were walking through cotton, isolated from the rest of the world. The path opened onto the pier about 20 yards from shore, The structure extended out over the lake, and I could see where it disappeared into the fog after maybe 15 feet. The water was perfectly still, a black mirror that reflected nothing. No ripples, no movement. Just that flat, dead surface that made my skin crawl for reasons I couldn't name. That's when Reeves stopped walking. His hand shot out, gripping my arm hard enough to hurt, and he pointed into the mist. I followed his gesture and felt something cold slide down my spine. There was a figure standing on the water, not near the shore, not on some hidden rock or sandbar. Standing on the surface itself, maybe 30 feet out, where the lake dropped to 60 feet deep according to Whitlock's earlier rambling. The silhouette was wrong, too still, too perfect in its balance. Human-shaped, but somehow not quite human in its proportions. The fog eddied around it, but it remained stationary, as if it had been there for hours. For years. Galloway muttered something under his breath, a half-formed question that none of us answered. The beam from his flashlight swept over the figure, and I caught a glimpse of what might have been clothing, dark and plastered to the body as if soaked through. But the details were indistinct, eaten by the mist and distance. We stood there for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. 4 grown men frozen on a pier in the middle of nowhere, staring at something that shouldn't exist. My heart hammered against my ribs. The rational part of my brain, the part that dealt with spreadsheets and quarterly reports, was offering explanations. A trick of the fog, a piece of driftwood standing upright, an optical illusion created by exhaustion and too much altitude. But I didn't believe any of it. My flashlight began to flicker, the beam stuttered, dimmed, and in that moment of failing light, the figure moved. It didn't walk or swim. It came at us, fast, impossibly fast. One moment it was 30 feet away, the next it had halved the distance, and I could see more details I didn't want to see. Hair matted and dark, hanging in thick ropes across a face I wouldn't look at directly. The movement was smooth, frictionless, without the bob and sway of someone running through water. It glided, and it made no sound, no splash, no breath, no footsteps on the water's surface, just that terrible silent approach through the fog. Reeves made a noise in his throat, high and strangled, and then we were all backing up, our coordinated retreat dissolving into a scramble of limbs and panic. Someone's elbow caught my ribs. Flashlight beams crossed and recrossed like searchlights, fragmenting the darkness into a nightmare of shadows and pale light. I could hear Whitlock repeating something, maybe a prayer, maybe just a string of profanity, under his breath. The figure was 20 feet away, 15. Then light flooded the pier. It came from behind us, harsh and yellow and blessedly bright. The kind of industrial spotlight that belongs on a construction site. The beam swept over us and out onto the water, and in that moment of illumination I saw the figure in perfect clarity. It was a woman, or had been. The hair was plastered across her face in thick strands, obscuring her features, but I could see the mouth hanging open in what might have been a scream or a gasp. Her clothes were dark and dripping, clinging to a frame that seemed too thin, almost emaciated. Her hands were raised, fingers splayed, reaching toward us. And then she was gone. Not slowly, not gradually. She simply ceased to exist, as if she'd been made of the fog itself and had evaporated under the spotlight's glare. 1 second I could see her clearly, every horrible detail, and the next there was only empty water and mist. The caretaker stood behind us, the spotlight in his weathered hands, his face expressionless in the backwash of light. Jensen, I remembered his name was. He'd been working the grounds all week, a silent presence that materialized to fix things and then disappeared again. He looked at each of us in turn, and I couldn't read his expression. Disappointment, maybe, or resignation. He told us to get back to the lodge, his voice flat and final. He didn't ask what we'd seen. He didn't offer explanations. He just watched us stumble past him back up the path, the spotlight's beam following us until we reached the main building. None of us spoke about it that night. We separated in the lodge's main room with mumbled goodnights, each retreating to our rooms like animals to their dens. I lay in bed listening to the old building settle and creak. my eyes fixed on the ceiling, my mind replaying those few seconds over and over. The figure, the speed, the silence, the impossibility. I must have slept eventually because I woke to pale morning light filtering through the curtains and the sound of voices outside. The fog had lifted, burned away by a weak autumn sun, and the lake looked almost cheerful in the early light. I dressed and went outside, drawn by some compulsion I didn't examine too closely. Whitlock and Reeves were already at the pier. Galloway joined me as I walked down, neither of us speaking. The caretaker was there too, standing at the pier's edge with his hands in his pockets, looking out over the water. There were no footprints. The wooden planks were damp with dew, but there was no trace of anyone having stood there the night before. No scuff marks, no disturbed boards, nothing to indicate 4 men had panicked their way back to safety in the dark. But there were other marks. On the vertical posts that supported the pier's railing, at eye level for someone standing on the boards, there were smudges, dark stains that looked like mud. As I got closer, the pattern became clear. Finger marks, 10 of them, pressed into the wood with enough force to leave clear impressions. They were elongated, as if made by fingers that had been reaching, straining upward. But they were 6 feet off the ground, 6 feet from where someone standing on the pier would have to reach up to make them, 6 feet above where anyone lying down could possibly have stretched. The angle was wrong. The height was wrong. Everything about them was wrong. Galloway asked Jensen what they were, his voice carefully neutral, and the caretaker just shook his head. Said he'd get some solvent and clean them off before lunch. Said sometimes the lake did strange things. Said we should probably head back for breakfast. We did. What else could we do? The retreat ended the next day. We packed our bags, made our polite goodbyes, and drove back down the mountain to our regular lives. In the car, with the radio playing and the distance growing between us and Thornwood Lake, it was easy to start doubting, to convince myself that panic and poor lighting and a night of drinking had conspired to play tricks on my perception. Except for the finger marks. Those had been real. I'd photographed them with my phone before Jensen could clean them away, though I haven't looked at the pictures since. Can't quite bring myself to open that folder. 3 weeks later, Reeves stopped showing up to work. HR said he'd taken a leave of absence for personal reasons. Whitlock requested a transfer to the West Coast office, and Galloway won't talk to me anymore. Just looks away whenever we pass in the hallway, like I remind him of something he'd rather forget. As for me, I've started sleeping with the lights on. Not every night. Just on the nights when I wake up with the taste of metal in my mouth and the sound of water lapping against wood in my ears. The nights when I'm certain, absolutely certain, that if I open my eyes I'll see wet footprints leading from my bedroom door to my bed. I tell myself it was the altitude, the stress, the power of suggestion working on 4 tired men in an isolated place. I tell myself there are rational explanations for everything we saw, if I just look hard enough, if I just think clearly enough. But sometimes late at night when the apartment is quiet and the city feels very far away, I wonder about those finger marks, about how high they were, about what kind of reach would be needed to make them from below. And I wonder what it was reaching for. The company is planning another retreat next month. Different location. Seaside this time, not mountains. They sent around an email asking who's interested. My finger hovered over the delete button for a long time before I filed it away in a folder I labeled Maybe. Because here's the thing that keeps me awake. Part of me wants to go. Part of me needs to see if it happens again, if it happens somewhere else. Part of me is starting to think that maybe, just maybe, we didn't see something at Thornwood Lake. Maybe something saw us, and maybe it's still looking. I've been having dreams lately. In them, I'm standing on a pier in the fog, my flashlight dying in my hand. I can hear water moving, but I can't see it. I can feel something watching me from just beyond the reach of my light. And I know, with the certainty that only comes in dreams, that if I wait long enough, if I stand very still, I'll see it again. That figure, that shape, that thing. And this time, I won't run. This time, I'll look it in the face. I don't know what scares me more, the thought that this might actually happen, or the realization that I want it to. The lake was supposed to be a one-time thing, a story for later, something to bring up over drinks and laugh about nervously. But it's not. It's gotten under my skin like a splinter, working its way deeper every day. I catch myself researching the history of Thornwood Lake online at 2 in the morning, reading old newspaper articles about drownings and disappearances, looking for patterns that might explain what we saw. I haven't found any answers, just more questions. And every time I look at my phone and see that folder of photos, the one I won't open, I wonder if the answer is right there, waiting. If I'm just too afraid to look. The caretaker knew something, I'm certain of it. The way he appeared with that spotlight at exactly the right moment, the way he didn't seem surprised, the way he talked about the lake doing strange things like he'd seen them before. I've thought about going back, driving up there without telling anyone, finding Jensen, and demanding answers. But what would I say? What would I ask? And what if the answer is worse than not knowing? So I stay in the city, and I keep the lights on, and I wait. For what? I'm not sure. Maybe for another retreat, another chance, another glimpse of whatever lives in the fog above Thornwood Lake. Or maybe I'm waiting for it to come find me. Either way, I don't think I'm sleeping tonight. Story 3. The crew always talked about the mirrors. After 3 months working inventory on the Serenade of the Seas, I'd heard every variation of the story. The ghost in Deck 7's boutique, the shadow that walked backwards through the jewelry displays, the thing that appeared when you were alone after the last passengers had stumbled back to their cabins. Superstitious nonsense, the kind of folklore that spreads through tight quarters and 14-hour shifts like mold through damp wood. I learned to smile and nod when the older crew members warned me. The veterans, the ones who'd worked ships for decades, they had this look in their eyes when they talked about it. Not fear exactly, more like recognition. Like they'd all seen the same thing but agreed never to describe it in detail. I should have paid attention to that look. The boutique sat on Deck 7, wedged between the main atrium and the photographer's gallery. During the day, it was all glittering watches and perfume samples, tourists pawing through logo t-shirts and overpriced sunglasses. At night, after we closed at 11, it became something else. The lighting shifted. Those same overhead LEDs that made everything sparkle during business hours cast shadows that seemed to pool in the corners, thick and reluctant to dissipate. I usually finished inventory by 1 in the morning. That gave me time to count stock, update the computer system, and prepare the deposit for the purser's office. The work was mindless, which I preferred. Count, type, cross-check. The rhythm kept me from thinking too much about the fact that the ship never truly slept, never stopped its endless churning through dark water. The mirror they talked about hung on the east wall, angled to give customers a view of themselves wearing whatever jewelry they were considering. It was a full-length thing, probably 6 feet tall, framed in fake brass that had long since lost its shine. During my first week, I'd check behind it, expecting to find some trick of the light, some explanation for the stories. There was nothing back there but wall and dust. It was a Thursday night, technically a Friday morning, when I first saw it. The ship had docked in Cozumel that day, and we'd had the usual surge of customers, all sunburned and drunk on margaritas, buying things they'd regret when their credit card bills arrived. The mess they'd left took me longer than usual to organize. The office desk faced away from the mirror, positioned so I could watch the boutique's entrance while I worked. Smart design, really. If anyone tried to break in, I'd see them before they saw me. But it also meant my back was to that mirror, and sometime around 2 in the morning, I felt it. You know that sensation. The weight of eyes on your spine. The primitive part of your brain that screams predator, even when you're alone. I turned around slowly, the way you do when you're trying to prove to yourself that there's nothing there. The boutique stretched out empty and still, swimsuit displays like frozen swimmers in the dim light. The mirror reflected the opposite wall, the racks of sunglasses, the jewelry case. And sitting at my desk, in the reflection, only in the reflection, was someone else. My hands went cold. The figure sat in my chair, or rather, in the reflection of my chair. I could see the back of their head, dark hair pulled into a bun, shoulders hunched over the desk as if they were working on something. But when I looked down at my actual desk, there was nothing. Just my laptop, my clipboard, my half-empty coffee cup. I looked back at the mirror. The figure remained, perfectly still. Every rational part of my brain tried to construct an explanation. Trick of the light. Fatigue. Some optical illusion created by the angle of the mirror and the weird LED glow. I stood up, my chair rolling backwards, and watched as the reflection showed no movement. The figure stayed seated, unaffected by my actions. Then it turned its head. Not toward me, toward the mirror, as if looking out from inside the glass. I saw a face, but the details wouldn't stick in my memory, like trying to remember a dream 5 seconds after waking. I had the impression of features, of eyes, but they slid away from my mind's grasp even as I stared. I left the boutique at a run, didn't log out of the computer, didn't lock the door, didn't even grab my jacket. I just ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty atrium, past the closed coffee bar and the silent grand piano, until I reached the crew quarters and slammed my cabin door shut. I told myself I wouldn't go back. I'd explained to my supervisor that I needed to switch shifts, work days instead of nights, make up some excuse about insomnia, about needing a schedule change for personal reasons. But the next evening, when I showed up for my shift, the boutique manager, a woman named Reyes who'd been working cruise ships since before I was born, she looked at me with that expression, that recognition. She said only one thing before leaving me to close up alone. When the ship stops, some memories keep sailing. I didn't understand what she meant. Not then. The second night I kept the lights brighter, played music from my phone, did everything I could to make the space feel occupied and alive. The mirror stayed empty, reflecting only what was actually there. I began to convince myself that I'd hallucinated the whole thing, fatigue and isolation playing tricks on an exhausted mind. But the objects started moving. Small things at first. I'd place a stack of inventory sheets perfectly parallel to the desk edge, and when I looked back, they'd be askew, crossed, like someone had deliberately arranged them into an X. I'd straighten a row of perfume bottles, all facing forward, and return from the stockroom to find one turned backwards. The rational explanations kept crumbling. The ship's vibrations couldn't account for such precise movements. There were no air currents strong enough to shift objects without disturbing anything else, and I was alone. The cameras showed only me entering and leaving, no one else in the boutique after closing. The sound started on the third night. Whispers, thin and distant, seeming to emanate from the elevator shafts that bordered the atrium. The ship had a massive central atrium, a cathedral of glass and steel rising through 7 decks, and the elevators ran through it like mechanical veins. At night, when no one was using them, they'd occasionally activate on their own. Safety checks, or so maintenance claimed. The motors would hum, cables would creak, and the cars would rise and fall through the dark shaft. But the whispers weren't mechanical sounds. They were voices, fragments of conversation, words just below the threshold of comprehension. I'd catch pieces, a syllable here, a breath there, but never enough to understand. They seemed to come from multiple directions at once, echoing through the ventilation ducts and the gaps around the elevator doors. I started keeping the boutique door closed while I worked. It didn't help. The whispers leaked in anyway, pooling in the corners of the room like the shadows. On the 4th night, I found the chair turned. I'd left it pushed under the desk, the way I always did, but when I came back from the stockroom, carrying a box of new merchandise, the chair had spun around to face the mirror, not pushed out, not knocked over, just rotated exactly 180 degrees, as if someone had sat down and deliberately turned to look at their reflection. The casters left no marks on the carpet. The chair's mechanism, one of those old hydraulic ones that squeaked whenever you adjusted the height, had moved in complete silence. I approached it slowly, that same primitive alarm screaming in my hindbrain. The chair sat empty and still, facing the mirror like an audience of one. I looked at the reflection, expecting to see that figure again, but the glass showed only the boutique at night. Empty racks, dead lights, and my own face, pale and drawn. I sat down in the chair, turned to face my desk, began working again, typing inventory numbers into the computer with hands that wanted to shake. Every few minutes I'd glance over my shoulder at the mirror. It showed only what should be there, but the feeling of being watched never left. It intensified, actually, until my skin crawled with it. Not just watched, studied, measured, as if something was comparing me to some internal template, checking for discrepancies. I started asking questions, talking to the older crew members, the ones who'd been on the Serenade for years. They were reluctant to speak at first, changing the subject or claiming they didn't know what I meant. But eventually, slowly, pieces of the story emerged. A crew member, years ago. Someone who'd worked the boutique shift before me. They'd disappeared between ports, there one day, gone the next. Their cabin was found undisturbed, their passport and belongings still in place. The official story was that they'd jumped ship in some port, gone AWOL. But the crew whispered about something else. No one would tell me what exactly. Just that things had been different since then. The mirrors acted up. Objects moved. People heard whispers in the empty spaces of the ship. The older crew members said the ship had absorbed something. That the endless churning through dark water, the constant motion, the thousands of passengers flowing through its corridors, all of it had created a kind of residue. Memories that wouldn't fade, impressions that wouldn't dissolve. I tried to rationalize it. Told myself it was just another layer of superstition, the kind of mythology that grows around any confined space where people work and live for months at a time. But the chair kept turning, the objects kept moving, and the whispers grew louder. On the 7th night, I saw my own reflection wrong. It was subtle at first. I'd glance at the mirror and see myself sitting at the desk, but the timing felt off. My reflection would move a half-second behind my actual movements, like a video with lag, or sometimes I'd catch it moving when I was perfectly still, shifting its weight or tilting its head as if looking at something I couldn't see. I started to avoid looking at mirrors entirely. The boutique had several. In addition to the large one, there were smaller mirrors scattered throughout the space, little vanity things next to jewelry displays. But I couldn't avoid them all. They were everywhere, and each one showed me something slightly wrong. An expression I wasn't making, a posture I hadn't adopted. Small discrepancies that made my stomach turn. The rational part of my mind, the part that still believed in optical illusions and fatigue-induced hallucinations, began to lose ground to something else. A creeping certainty that I wasn't experiencing anything supernatural at all, that I was losing my grip on reality, my brain slowly detaching from consensus perception. Which was worse, really? A haunted mirror or a mind eating itself? I couldn't tell anyone. Who would I talk to? The ship's doctor would ground me, send me to a psychiatrist when we docked. I'd lose my job, my work visa, everything I'd built. So I kept showing up for my shifts, kept counting inventory and updating spreadsheets while the whispers grew louder and the reflections grew stranger. The ship made port every few days, but the stops didn't help. If anything, the phenomena intensified when we were docked, as if the stillness, the absence of that constant churning motion, allowed something to surface. When the engines were quiet, I could hear the whispers more clearly. When the ship stopped swaying, the reflections held still enough to see their wrongness. Reyes found me one morning, after a particularly bad night. I'd been sitting at the desk for 3 hours, unable to work, just staring at the computer screen while my reflection did something else entirely in the mirror. She looked at me for a long moment, then closed the boutique door. "You need to stop looking," she said quietly. I asked her what she meant. The mirror, the reflections. You need to stop paying attention to them. That's what feeds it. I told her I didn't understand. She sighed, and in that sigh was decades of exhaustion, of knowledge she wished she didn't possess. "The ship remembers people," she said. "The ones who work here, who spend months in these spaces. Sometimes it remembers too well. And when it remembers someone who isn't here anymore, it tries to fill in the gap, uses whoever's closest as a template. The implication settled over me like ice water. I asked her what happened to the person who worked this shift before me. They started seeing themselves, Reyes said, in the mirror, but not quite right, like the ship was practicing trying to perfect the copy. By the end, they couldn't tell which reflection was really them, whether they were the person sitting at the desk or the one looking back from the glass. She left without saying anything else. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what she'd told me, trying to decide if I believed it or if I was just looking for any explanation that made sense, even a supernatural one. That night I worked facing away from all the mirrors, positioned my chair so that I couldn't accidentally glance at any reflective surface. It helped for a while, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. The weight of those invisible eyes grew heavier, more insistent. Around 3 a.m, I heard the chair behind me move. Not the chair I was sitting in, a second chair, rolling across the carpet with that distinctive sound of casters on commercial-grade fibers. I froze, my hands hovering over the keyboard. The sound stopped. Then I heard breathing. Quiet, even breaths, coming from directly behind me, from where that second chair would be, if there was a second chair. Which there wasn't. I knew there wasn't. I'd checked the boutique layout 100 times. I didn't turn around. Some instinct, some deep animal knowledge, told me that turning around would be the worst possible thing I could do. That whatever was breathing behind me wanted me to look, needed me to look, and if I did, something would fundamentally change. So I sat there, paralyzed, listening to the breathing that shouldn't exist. It matched my own rhythm exactly. Inhale, exhale, the same depth, the same timing, like it was synchronizing with me, learning from me. The breathing continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then it stopped. The weight of watching eyes lifted. The oppressive atmosphere eased just slightly. When I finally allowed myself to turn around, the boutique was empty. The mirror showed only the regular reflection. The dark store, the merchandise racks, me sitting alone at my desk. But something had changed. I could feel it. Some threshold had been crossed. Some process initiated that couldn't be reversed. I've been on the ship for 3 weeks since that night. The phenomena haven't stopped, but they've evolved. Sometimes I catch myself doing things I don't remember deciding to do. Standing in front of the mirror when I'm sure I was sitting at my desk. Reaching for objects I have no reason to touch. Speaking words I don't recall saying. Yesterday, I found a note in my handwriting that I didn't write. It was on my desk, tucked under the keyboard. Just 3 words. Stop resisting this. I don't know if I wrote it during some fugue state, if my mind is fragmenting under the pressure, or if something else is learning to use my hands, my voice, my movements. If the ship is practicing, perfecting its copy, getting ready to make the switch. Reyes won't talk to me anymore. She sees me in the corridors and looks away quickly like she's afraid, or like she's already mourning. Tonight, as I sit here counting inventory in the dim boutique, I can see 2 chairs in the mirror, mine and one behind it, both occupied, both with someone sitting in them, backs to the glass, working at the same desk. I haven't looked over my shoulder to check which chair is real. I'm not sure I want to know which one I'm sitting in. The ship never stops moving. The engines churn, the water churns, and somewhere in that constant motion, memories keep sailing, getting sharper, getting clearer, until they're more real than the originals they replaced. In the mirror, the second chair is starting to turn. I can feel my own chair beginning to move. Both of us rotating toward each other, getting ready to compare notes, to see which one is closer to what the ship remembers, which one will stay, and which one will become just another story the crew tells late at night, when the tourists are sleeping and the corridors are dark. The whispers are louder now. They're not coming from the elevator shafts anymore. They're coming from my own throat, words I'm speaking without meaning to, conversations I'm having with no one I can see. Or maybe I'm the one no one can see. Maybe I've already become what the mirror was practicing to create, a memory that kept sailing, a reflection that learned to exist without the original. The chair is still turning. Both chairs, moving in perfect synchronization, getting ready to face each other across the desk that might not be there. Across the boundary between what's real and what the ship insists is real. I should be terrified. Part of me is. But another part, a part that feels older than the weeks I've been experiencing this, older than my time on this ship, feels something else. Recognition. Like I've been here before. Like I've always been here. Sitting in this boutique at 3 a.m, watching my reflection perfect itself, waiting for the moment when the ship decides which version it prefers. The chair completes its rotation. I'm face to face with myself across the desk. Both of us. Identical. Both of us. Real. Both of us. Wondering which one is the ghost. In the mirror behind us both, a third chair is beginning to appear. The ship remembers, and it keeps sailing, and some of us never leave. Story 4. The teepee stood in the clearing like something that didn't belong, canvas stretched over wooden poles, a pale cone against the darkening scrub of West Texas. My brother had insisted on putting it up during his sustainable living phase, back when he thought returning to the land meant sleeping in a glorified tent instead of the perfectly good ranch house 200 yards away. Now it was mine for the weekend, a novelty for city soft hands that hadn't gripped a saddle in 15 years. The November wind carried the smell of creosote and dust. I stood at the teepee's entrance, watching the sun bleed out behind the hills, turning the sky the color of a bruise. My sister-in-law had mentioned she'd be staying in the main house, something about her back not handling the ground anymore. I didn't mind. The solitude felt earned after the divorce, after the apartment that always smelled like someone else's cooking, after the job that had ground me down to nothing but a paycheck and a persistent ringing in my ears that doctors said was stress. That first evening, I walked the property. The family ranch sprawled across 200 acres of scrubland and rocky outcroppings, threaded through with dry creek beds that only ran during the rare storms. The stock tank, what they called a pond out here, sat a quarter-mile from the teepee, down a worn path through mesquite and prickly pear. Cattle had trampled the earth into a hard-packed trail, dotted with their dried droppings and the occasional coyote track. I needed firewood. The temperature would drop to the 40s once the sun disappeared completely, and the teepee's fire pit was just a ring of stones with cold ash in its center. My brother had left an axe leaning against a cedar post, its edge dulled by use and neglect. The trees near the stock tank were dead things, victims of the drought 3 years back. Their branches reached upward like broken fingers, stripped of bark by weather and time. I chose one that had fallen, its trunk split and already half-seasoned, and began splitting manageable pieces, each strike of the axe sending tremors up my arms. The sun was a memory now, just a faint orange glow on the horizon. Shadows pooled under the mesquite bushes, thick and absolute. I gathered an armful of wood and turned back toward the trail. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was another dead tree, just an odd silhouette I hadn't noticed on the way down. But trees don't stand in the middle of trails. This one, this thing, was positioned directly in the path, 20 yards ahead. The shape was wrong, too angular, too deliberately placed. Something that might have been a branch extended upward, held above where a head would be, if it had a head. My throat tightened. The wood felt suddenly heavy in my arms. The figure didn't move. In the failing light, I couldn't make out details, just the outline of something roughly man-sized, stationary, that branch or limb raised overhead like a weapon or a signal. I should have called out, should have asked if someone needed help, if they were lost on the property, but the silence felt wrong, too complete, as if the usual evening sounds of crickets and distant cattle had been swallowed by something hungry. My sister-in-law's name caught in my throat. I tried to form it, to shout for her, but only managed a hoarse approximation that didn't carry far. "I'm right here." Her voice came from behind me. I spun, dropping half the firewood, my heart slamming against my ribs. She stood at the teepee's entrance, illuminated by a camping lantern she must have lit while I was gone. The warm glow made her face look strange, shadows cutting unfamiliar angles across features I'd known for 12 years. I turned back toward the stock tank trail. The path was empty, just mesquite shadows and the vague shapes of dead trees in the distance, none of them positioned where the figure had been. You thought what? She stepped closer, and I noticed she was wearing different clothes than earlier. A heavy jacket now, work boots instead of the sneakers she'd had on during dinner. Nothing. Thought I saw something by the tank. She followed my gaze, her expression unreadable. Probably a deer. They come down to drink at dusk. I gathered the dropped firewood, my hands unsteady. You weren't in the house? Been in the teepee for the last 10 minutes, getting your bedding sorted. Why? The explanation died on my lips. I'd seen her walk to the house after we'd finished setting up my sleeping space. Watched her go inside, seen the kitchen light come on. But the distance between here and there, in this light, maybe I'd been wrong about the timing. Maybe she'd come back out while I was at the tank. We didn't talk much as I built the fire. She mentioned something about checking the fence line in the morning, asked if I remembered how to work the camp stove for coffee. Her words felt distant, rehearsed, like dialogue from a play where I'd missed the first act. When she left, and I watched her walk all the way to the house this time, watched the porch light come on and the door close, I sat by the fire and tried to convince myself that what I'd seen was nothing, a dead tree, a trick of the shadows. My mind, finally cracking under the accumulated weight of bad decisions and worse outcomes. The fire popped and hissed. Sparks drifted upward, dying before they reached the teepee's smoke hole. Beyond the circle of firelight, the darkness was total, the kind of black you never get in the city. No light pollution, no street lamps, just an infinite void that pressed against the canvas walls. I should have slept. Instead, I lay on the bedroll, staring at the canvas above, watching how the firelight painted shifting patterns on the fabric. The temperature dropped. I could see my breath, little clouds that dissipated in the dim glow. Outside, something moved through the brush, the soft rustle of an animal passing, probably the deer my sister-in-law had mentioned. Then I heard the footsteps, not the tentative pad of a deer, not the skittering of javelina or the prowl of a coyote. Heavy, deliberate footfalls, the kind made by something that didn't care about being quiet. They came from the direction of the stock tank, moving fast, building speed, running toward the teepee. I sat up, my breath catching. The fire had burned down to coals, offering almost no light. The footsteps grew louder, closer, a rhythmic pounding that shook the ground. Whatever was coming wasn't slowing down. The impact hit the teepee's side with enormous force. I heard the canvas tear, a long grinding sound of something dragging across the fabric, like nails on cloth magnified 1,000 times. One of the support ropes snapped with a crack that echoed in the clearing. The entire structure shuddered, tilting slightly, and I scrambled backward, pressing against the far wall. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence. My heart hammered so hard I thought my ribs would crack. I stayed frozen, waiting for another impact, for whatever had hit the teepee to tear through the entrance and what? What was I expecting? Minutes passed, maybe hours. Time felt elastic, unreliable. Finally, when my legs cramped from staying in the same position, I crawled to the entrance and looked out. The clearing was empty. Moonlight painted everything in shades of silver and black. The mesquite bushes stood motionless. No wind, no movement, nothing. I grabbed the camping lantern and stepped outside, sweeping the beam across the ground. The teepee's canvas showed a long tear along one side, the edges frayed and dirty. The support rope dangled loose, its end showing fresh damage where it had snapped. But it was the ground that made my stomach turn. 2 parallel grooves cut through the dirt, starting about 20 feet from the teepee, and ending right at the wall where the impact had occurred. They were deep, at least 2 inches, and wide, maybe 6 inches each. The spacing between them suggested something the width of a man's shoulders, but the marks themselves didn't match anything I recognized. No boot prints, no hoof marks, no paw impressions, just these smooth, parallel trenches, as if something impossibly heavy had been dragged across the ground, or as if something had dragged itself. I followed the grooves backward with the lantern. They continued past the clearing's edge, into the brush toward the stock tank, before disappearing into the harder ground where the vegetation thickened. My hand shook, making the light bounce erratically. The smart thing would have been to walk to the house, wake my sister-in-law, have her look at this with fresh eyes. But standing there in the cold, staring at those grooves, I couldn't move. Something about them felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. Wrong in the same way the figure on the trail had been wrong. A coyote yipped in the distance. The sound made me flinch so hard I nearly dropped the lantern. I returned to the teepee and didn't sleep. Just sat by the rekindled fire, watching the entrance, listening to every sound. When dawn finally came, gray and cold, I felt like I'd aged years in a single night. My sister-in-law found me making coffee on the camp stove, my hands still trembling slightly. "You look terrible," she said, studying my face with an expression I couldn't read. I told her about the footsteps, about the impact on the teepee wall. She walked around the structure, examined the torn canvas and the broken rope, crouched down to look at the grooves in the dirt. "Could have been a bull," she offered, but her voice lacked conviction. "We've got a couple that wander off from the Henderson place sometimes. Bulls have hooves. Could have dragged something, a branch maybe, caught in its horns." She stood up, brushing dust from her jeans. Her eyes didn't meet mine. "Or could have been the wind. Gets pretty fierce out here at night. Things blow around, hit the teepee, drag across the ground. There wasn't any wind last night." She was quiet for a moment, looking past me toward the stock tank trail. "This property has stories," she finally said. "Going back to when my husband's great-grandfather first settled it. Workers who quit after one night, cattle that went crazy for no reason, fences torn down by something that wasn't a person and wasn't an animal. But they're just stories. Ranch life gets lonely. People's minds play tricks." "What did you see?" I asked. "When you've been out here alone?" Her expression closed off like a door slamming shut. "Nothing I can explain, nothing I want to think about." She picked up her truck keys from where she'd set them on a rock. "I'm heading into town for supplies. You should come with me. Get some breakfast, clear your head." I almost went, almost grabbed my jacket and followed her to the truck. But something in how she'd said it, the carefully casual tone, the too quick suggestion, made me hesitate. "I think I'll stay. Clean up this mess, maybe fix the rope." She didn't argue, didn't try to convince me. Just nodded once and drove away, gravel crunching under her tires. I watched until the dust settled and the sound of the engine faded completely. Then I walked back to the stock tank. In daylight, the path looked ordinary, just a worn trail through typical Texas scrubland. But I couldn't shake the image of that figure, that raised branch, the wrongness of its proportions. I walked slowly, scanning the ground, the bushes, looking for anything unusual. The grooves appeared again about halfway to the tank. They emerged from the harder ground near a dead mesquite, cutting across the trail in the same parallel pattern. I knelt down, running my fingers along the edges. The dirt was compressed, pushed aside by something smooth and heavy, no texture, no identifying marks. I followed them into the brush. They wove between bushes, always maintaining the same spacing, the same depth. Sometimes they'd disappear where the ground was too hard or rocky, then reappear a few feet later. They led me in a rough circle around the teepee, starting and ending near the stock tank, as if something had been pacing, circling, watching. The sun climbed higher, but I felt cold. I returned to the teepee and tried to occupy myself with mundane tasks, fixing the rope, patching the canvas with duct tape, organizing my supplies. But my mind kept returning to those grooves, to the figure on the trail, to my sister-in-law's voice coming from behind me when I'd been sure she was in the house. That afternoon, I dozed off despite myself, exhaustion finally overwhelming adrenaline. I dreamed of the clearing, but in the dream, it was full of figures, all of them standing motionless with branches raised overhead, all of them watching me with faces I couldn't quite see. I woke to footsteps. For a moment I thought I was still dreaming, but no, The sound was real, coming from outside the teepee. Slow footsteps, deliberate, circling the structure. I could hear the crunch of gravel, the soft displacement of dirt. My throat closed. The sun was setting again, painting the canvas in shades of amber and red. How long had I slept? The footsteps stopped directly outside the entrance. I held my breath, every muscle locked. Waited for the flap to open, for something to step inside. My vision narrowed to that canvas door, that thin barrier between me and whatever stood on the other side. "You awake in there?" My sister-in-law's voice. Normal, casual, like she was asking if I wanted coffee. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. "I brought dinner. Figured you wouldn't want to cook after last night." The flap opened. She stepped inside carrying a covered dish. She looked exactly like she always had. Same clothes, same face, same person I'd known for over a decade. "You okay?" she asked, setting down the dish. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I swallowed hard. I heard footsteps. Before you called out. That was me. I parked by the house and walked over. She studied my face. "You really didn't sleep, did you?" The food smelled real. Her voice sounded real. But something felt off. Some fundamental wrongness I couldn't identify. The way she stood too still, maybe. The way her shadow fell at an angle that didn't quite match the light source. Or maybe I was losing my mind. We ate in uncomfortable silence. She made small talk about her trip to town, about supplies and neighbors and nothing that mattered. I responded with automatic words, yes and no, and that's interesting, while my mind tried to reconcile the impossible. After she left, and I watched her walk away again, watched until she was inside the house with the lights on, I sat by the fire and faced the truth I'd been avoiding. Either something was out there, something that could make sounds like footsteps and tear canvas and leave grooves in the dirt while wearing no recognizable form, or I was having a breakdown, my mind constructing elaborate delusions from shadows and stress and isolation. Both options terrified me equally. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I kept the fire high, kept the lantern burning, kept the axe within reach. Every sound made me flinch, the pop of sap in burning wood, the rustle of a night bird, the distant howl of coyotes. Around 3 a.m, I heard them again. The footsteps. Closer this time, just beyond the firelight's reach. Moving slowly, deliberately, circling the teepee in the same pattern as the grooves. I gripped the axe and waited. The sounds continued for an hour, maybe longer. Always just outside the light, always at that measured pace. Sometimes they'd stop, and I'd hear nothing for long minutes. Then they'd resume, starting from a different direction. When dawn came, I walked the perimeter of the teepee. Fresh grooves marked the ground in a complete circle, as if something had dragged itself around and around the canvas structure all night long. The pattern was perfect, geometric, nothing like the random wandering of an animal. My sister-in-law didn't come that morning. I saw lights on in the house, saw smoke from the chimney, but she stayed inside. And I understood that she knew, had always known, that whatever this was, she'd experienced it too, had chosen not to speak about it because speaking makes things real. I should have left then, should have packed up and driven away and never looked back. But I didn't, because standing there in the morning light, looking at those grooves, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The parallel lines, the spacing, the deliberate circle around the teepee, they weren't random. They were a message, a communication from something that understood intention and meaning. And as I stared at them, trying to decipher that message, I saw my own shadow cast on the ground by the rising sun, long and dark and distorted by the angle of the light. Behind my shadow, just at the edge of my peripheral vision, another shadow stood, tall and wrong and holding something overhead, exactly where the figure had been on the trail that first evening. I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, the shadow was gone. Just mine now, solitary and unremarkable. But I could still feel it, standing there, watching, waiting. And I knew that whatever was in the clearing, it wasn't going to let me leave until I understood what it wanted me to understand. That I was never alone out here. That I had never been alone. And that understanding changed nothing at all. Story 5. The knocking started at 3:47 a.m. I know the exact time because I'd been staring at my phone for the past hour, unable to sleep despite the bone-deep exhaustion from our 8-hour drive upstate. The cabin rental, a weather-beaten A-frame tucked into a grove of white pines, had seemed charming in the listing photos. In person, surrounded by the pressing darkness of the Adirondack wilderness, it felt like something else entirely, something older. The sound came again. Not the aggressive pounding you'd expect from someone in distress, but measured, almost polite. 3 deliberate taps against the bedroom window, knuckles on glass. My fiancée stirred beside me, her breathing pattern shifting but not quite breaking into consciousness. I stayed perfectly still, listening. The wind had been brutal all evening, rattling the loose boards of the cabin's exterior, so perhaps that's all it was. A branch, a trick of the storm. Then came the voice. Please, soft, feminine, barely audible through the single-pane glass. Just for a moment. I need you to unlock it. Every muscle in my body locked. The voice was polite, almost apologetic, but there was something underneath it, something that made my scalp prickle with instinctive dread. It was the politeness itself that felt wrong, too measured, like someone carefully imitating human speech patterns without quite understanding the emotion behind them. My fiancée's hand found mine in the darkness, her grip sudden and fierce. She was awake. She'd heard it too. We didn't speak. Some unspoken agreement passed between us. Keep the lights off, stay quiet, maybe it would go away. The bedroom window faced the gravel driveway, and through the thin curtains I could make out a pale shape against the glass. Moonlight filtered through the cloud cover, just enough to reveal a silhouette that might have been a woman. Might have been. There was something wrong with her head. The profile showed 2 rigid protrusions from the forehead area, casting shadows that stretched upward like horns. But horns was the wrong word. They looked broken, angular, as if something had fractured the skull and the bone had healed wrong, jutting out at unnatural angles. I won't hurt you, the voice continued, still with that careful politeness. I just need inside. Just for a moment. My fiancée's breathing had gone shallow beside me. I wanted to tell her it was okay, that we were safe, but my throat had closed up. The rational part of my brain scrambled for explanations. A lost hiker, someone injured, someone who needed help. But that rational part felt very small now, overwhelmed by something older, something that lived in the base of the spine and whispered danger. The shape at the window shifted closer. I could see now that it was luminous somehow, not reflecting the moonlight but generating its own faint glow. Milky, corpse pale, the hand rose to press against the glass, fingers splayed wide. We watched in silence as condensation began to bloom around that hand, spreading outward in a perfect outline. The room temperature had dropped noticeably. I could see my breath now, small clouds in the darkness. Then the shape retreated. No footsteps, no sound of movement through the gravel. It simply faded back into the night as if it had never been there at all. We didn't sleep again that night. When dawn finally broke, gray and cold, I worked up the courage to go outside. The gravel driveway was still damp from yesterday's rain, perfect for holding impressions. I walked the entire perimeter of the bedroom window twice, crouching low to examine every inch. Nothing, not a single footprint, not a disturbed pebble. But inside, on the window glass, the handprint remained. The condensation had long since evaporated, but the mark was still there, a perfect outline of 5 fingers and a palm, pressed against the inside of the window, as if someone had been measuring the distance to the lock from within the room. My fiancée suggested we leave. Pack up, forfeit the rental fee, get back to the city where things made sense. But I'd paid for the whole weekend, and in the harsh light of morning, the whole experience felt increasingly dreamlike. Shared nightmare, maybe. Carbon monoxide hallucination. The cabin was old. Perhaps there was a leak. We'd been exhausted from the drive, stress from wedding planning. The mind could conjure anything under the right conditions. I almost convinced myself. The day passed uneventfully. We hiked a nearby trail, had lunch in the town 5 miles down the mountain road, tried to shake off the previous night's unease with normalcy and sunshine. The locals at the diner were friendly enough, though I noticed the waitress's expression shift when I mentioned where we were staying. Frost Hollow, she said, not quite a question. That's the old Brennan place. She didn't elaborate, and something about her tone made me not want to ask. By the time we returned to the cabin, dusk was already settling into the valleys. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees, and a thick fog was rolling up from the lake below, turning the pine trees into ghostly sentinels. We locked every door, every window, checked them twice. I even wedged a chair under the bedroom door handle, feeling ridiculous but unable to stop myself. My fiancée tried to make light of it, joking about my newfound paranoia, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes kept darting to the windows. We turned on every light in the cabin, made dinner, opened a bottle of wine, tried to create an atmosphere of normalcy, but the wilderness pressed in around us, vast and indifferent, and the lights only made the darkness beyond the windows more absolute. Around 11 p.m., my phone died, then hers. Both fully charged that morning, both suddenly dead, screens refusing to respond. The cabin had no landline. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles away through dense forest. "We're leaving first thing tomorrow," my fiancé said, and I didn't argue. We went to bed early, lights still blazing throughout the cabin. I'd almost drifted off when I heard it, not knocking this time, but scratching. Long, deliberate scrapes against the exterior wall, moving slowly from the living room toward the bedroom. The sound of something with claws or fingernails grown too long, dragging across wooden siding. The scratching stopped directly outside the bedroom window. I lay frozen, listening. My fiancée had gone rigid beside me, her hand finding mine again. Neither of us dared to look at the window, to see what might be standing there in the fog. The silence stretched out, broken only by our rapid breathing and the distant groan of wind through the pines. Then the scratching resumed, but this time it was inside the walls, moving through the insulation, through the hollow spaces between studs, circling the room, searching. "It can't get in," I whispered, more to convince myself than her. We locked everything. The scratching stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, I heard something else, a sound like sniffing, like something inhaling deeply at the gap under the door. Then that voice again, still soft, still polite, but closer now. "You have to invite me. You have to open it." My mind reeled. That phrasing, "invite me." Suddenly I was remembering old folklore, vampire stories, the rules about thresholds. But that was just superstition, fairy tales. This was real, wasn't it? "Go away," my fiancée called out, her voice stronger than I could have managed. "We don't want you here." A long pause, then a sound that might have been laughter, breathy and wrong. "But you came to me," the voice replied. "You came to my house." The fog had grown so thick outside that I could no longer see the trees. The bedroom window showed nothing but white, as if we'd been transported into a void, and there in that whiteness a shape was forming. Not solid, but condensing out of the fog itself. That same pale figure, those same broken protrusions from the forehead area, but clearer now. I could see that the face was beautiful in a terrible way, features too symmetrical, too perfect, like a death mask. "This was never the Brennan place," the voice continued, conversational now. "They just borrowed it, like you, like everyone who comes here." A pause. "But I was here first. I'm always here first." The shape pressed against the window, and this time I could see details I'd missed before. The protrusions weren't horns. They were bone, skull fragments, pushing up through translucent skin. And the hands, when they touched the glass, left those same condensation prints, but now I could see they were backwards. The thumb was on the wrong side, the fingers bent at impossible angles. "Why won't you let me in?" The voice had taken on a plaintive quality, almost hurt. "I'm so cold out here. I've been cold for so long." My fiancée made a small sound in her throat. I looked at her and saw her eyes were glazed, unfocused, her lips parting as if to speak. Her hand slipped from mine, reaching slowly toward the window latch. "No." I grabbed her wrist, pulled her back. She blinked, awareness flooding back into her expression, and let out a shuddering gasp. "It was in my head," she whispered. I could feel it trying to. The window exploded inward, not shattered, not broken. It simply ceased to exist, along with a section of the wall. One moment solid wood and glass, the next moment a gaping hole open to the fog and the thing that lived in it. The cold rushed in like a living force, stealing the breath from our lungs, coating every surface with a rime of frost. The shape stood at the threshold, not quite crossing it, waiting. Up close, I could see it wasn't entirely solid. Parts of it phased in and out of visibility, as if it existed only partially in our reality. The broken bone fragments protruding from its forehead caught what little light remained, throwing jagged shadows across its too perfect face. Its eyes were milky white, no iris, no pupil, but they tracked us with terrible intelligence. "You have to choose," it said, and now the politeness was gone from its voice, replaced with something ancient and hungry. "You can leave, walk out into the fog, and you'll find your way eventually. Maybe. Or you can stay and we can come to an arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" The question came out before I could stop it. Its smile revealed teeth that were all wrong. Too many, too sharp, arranged in rows like a shark's. "I need someone to tend the place, to keep it warm, to make sure visitors come, just until spring. Then you can go." "That's 4 months," I said. "Is it? Time moves differently here. It might be 4 months. It might be 40 years. It tilted its head, considering. "Hard to say. I lose track." My fiancée was pulling at my arm, her voice urgent but distant, as if coming from very far away. I realized with growing horror that I was actually considering it, the offer, whatever it was. Some part of my mind had already begun calculating, rationalizing, finding reasons why this might make sense. That's when I understood the truth. It wasn't just at the window anymore. It had been inside my head for hours, maybe since the moment we'd arrived, whispering, suggesting, making this place feel isolated and wrong so that when it finally made its offer, we'd be desperate enough to accept. I forced myself to focus on my fiancée's face, her eyes, the solid reality of her presence. She was real. She was here. Everything else was negotiable. "We're leaving," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "Now." We ran. Through the fog, through the darkness, stumbling over roots and rocks we couldn't see. Behind us, that polite voice called out, no longer pleading but laughing, the sound echoing through the trees like wind chimes made of bones. The fog seemed to thicken with each step, wrapping around us like cobwebs, trying to turn us around, trying to lead us back. But there was one thing the fog couldn't obscure: the road. We'd parked on a gravel turnoff, and our feet found it by sound alone, the crunch of stones under our shoes. We followed it down the mountain, running until our lungs burned, until the fog finally began to thin. We didn't stop until we reached the town, didn't look back until the sun was rising over the mountains, burning away the last wisps of fog like a fever breaking. In the harsh light of morning, it all seemed impossible again. A nightmare, shared delusion. But my fiancée still has marks on her wrist where I grabbed her. And sometimes, in quiet moments, I catch myself listening for that polite voice, that gentle knocking, because part of me knows the truth. It wasn't trying to get in. It was trying to keep us from getting out. We never went back for our things. Let the rental company keep the deposit, charge us for damages, whatever. Some places you don't return to. Some thresholds you don't cross twice. Though on particularly cold nights when fog rolls in from nowhere and the temperature drops without reason, I find myself wondering, did we really leave? Or did we accept its offer without realizing it? After all, it said time moves differently there. 4 months might feel like 4 hours. 40 years might feel like a single weekend. And sometimes just before I fall asleep, I hear it again. That soft, polite voice. That gentle knocking. Just for a moment, it whispers. Just let me in. But I don't know anymore which side of the window I'm on. Story 6. The first crack of thunder felt like the sky splitting open above us, and that's when we knew we'd made a mistake. The storm had been building for hours while we hiked the ridge trail, dark clouds tumbling over themselves in their rush to catch us, but we'd been stupid enough to think we could make it back to base camp before it hit. Now the rain came down in sheets so thick I could barely see 3 feet ahead, turning the dirt path into a mudslide beneath our boots. That's when I spotted the entrance. A concrete mouth yawning open in the hillside where the old highway used to run before they rerouted it 15 years back. The tunnel had been sealed off, or so I thought, but erosion and time had peeled back the chain-link fence like the lid of a sardine can. It wasn't inviting exactly, but it was dry, and the alternative was getting swept off the trail by water rushing down from the peaks above. I grabbed my companion by the shoulder and pointed. He nodded, water streaming off the brim of his cap, and we scrambled down the embankment toward the opening. The sound of the storm intensified as we ducked inside. Not softer, but different, more resonant, like we'd stepped into the throat of some massive instrument being played by the wind. The relief of being out of the rain lasted exactly as long as it took for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. The tunnel stretched ahead of us, deeper than I'd expected, the gray afternoon light penetrating maybe 30 feet before dissolving into absolute black. Water dripped from the curved ceiling, each drop striking the cracked concrete floor with a sound that seemed to travel in both directions at once. The walls were tagged with graffiti, layers of spray paint overlapping until the original messages were lost in a chaos of color and form. In the dim light, some of the shapes seemed to move, writhing like they were trying to pull themselves free from the concrete. We moved further in, our footsteps creating a strange percussion against the steady rhythm of the rain outside. The tunnel was wider than I'd expected, built to accommodate 2 lanes of traffic back when this route had been the main artery through the mountains. Now it was just a void, a space carved out of the earth and then abandoned, left to slowly collapse in on itself. I could feel the weight of all that stone and soil pressing down from above, tons of mountain held back by aging concrete and rusting rebar. My companion pulled out his phone, thumbing it on to use as a flashlight, but the battery was nearly dead. He muttered something I couldn't quite hear over the ambient noise of the storm, then dug in his pack for headphones. I watched him plug them in, watched his expression shift as whatever music he'd queued up started playing. His lips moved slightly, keeping time with a beat only he could hear, and suddenly, I felt very alone despite standing just a few feet away from him. The isolation was immediate and profound. With him lost in his private soundscape, the tunnel seemed to grow larger around me, the darkness at the far end pressing closer. I turned away, examining the graffiti on the walls more closely, trying to distract myself from the creeping sense that we'd made another mistake by coming in here. Some of the tags were recent, bright colors that hadn't yet faded, but others were ancient, dates scrawled in faded paint that went back decades. Someone had written, "Listen," in tall letters near the entrance, the word repeated over and over, smaller each time, until it disappeared into a crack in the concrete. That's when the echo started. At first, I thought it was just the acoustics of the space, the way sound bounced off the curved walls and came back distorted. I'd said something, can't even remember what now, maybe just commenting on the graffiti or wondering how long the storm would last. And the words came back to me slightly delayed, slightly wrong. Not exactly wrong, but changed somehow, like they'd been filtered through something between the walls and my ears. I said something else, testing it. The echo returned, but this time it wasn't just a reflection. It was a completion. I'd said we should check how far back the tunnel went, and the echo finished my sentence before I did, adding that we might find another exit on the far side. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, but I told myself it was just a trick of the acoustics, some weird property of the curved walls that made it seem like the sound was anticipating my words instead of following them. My companion remained oblivious, his head bobbing slightly to his music. I wanted to reach out and pull the headphones from his ears, to ask him if he heard it too, but something stopped me. A growing certainty that if I drew his attention to the echo it would stop, and I'd be left looking foolish, or worse, concerned about my own mental state. So I stayed quiet, listening to the drip of water and the muffled roar of the storm outside, trying to convince myself that the tunnel was just a tunnel, empty except for us and our shadows. Then I asked the question that changed everything. I needed to orient myself, to figure out which direction we'd come from and which way we'd need to go when the storm passed. The rain had been so heavy, the scramble down to the tunnel so chaotic, that I'd lost track of our position relative to the camp. So I said it out loud, half to myself and half to my companion who couldn't hear me anyway. Which way do we go back to camp? The answer came immediately, spoken directly into my right ear with such clarity that I felt breath against my skin. A single word. Left. I spun around, heart hammering, but there was no one there. Just my companion, still absorbed in his music, his back to me as he examined something on the wall. Just the empty tunnel stretching away in both directions, the darkness at both ends seeming to pulse with the same rhythm as my racing pulse. Just the echo, except it wasn't an echo anymore. Couldn't be an echo, because I'd felt that breath, warm and slightly damp, carrying the scent of something I couldn't quite identify. Not decay, but something organic and old, like soil turned over after a long winter. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a piece of broken concrete, and grabbed my companion's arm. He pulled out one earbud, irritation flashing across his face before he saw my expression. I must have looked as terrified as I felt, because his annoyance immediately shifted to concern. He asked what was wrong, and I tried to explain, tried to tell him about the voice, but it came out garbled and nonsensical. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind, which maybe I had, and said he hadn't heard anything, hadn't said anything, had been listening to music the whole time. The storm chose that moment to intensify, a roll of thunder so deep and prolonged that it felt like the mountain itself was groaning. The tunnel seemed to contract around us, the walls pressing in, and I knew with sudden, absolute certainty that we needed to leave. Needed to get out right now. Consequences be damned. I told him we were going, pointing toward the entrance we'd come through, and he nodded, following me without argument. But then I hesitated. The voice had said left. We'd entered from the right side of the tunnel, which meant going back out would be going right. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to ignore the voice, to go right, to get out the way we'd come in. But what if the voice had been trying to help? What if there was something out there, something waiting in the direction we'd come from? My companion was already moving toward the entrance, and I followed, pushing aside the doubt, the creeping certainty that we were making a mistake. We emerged back into the storm, water immediately plastering my hair to my skull, running in rivulets down my neck. The rain was even heavier than before, turning the world into a blur of gray and green. But we pushed on, following the embankment away from the tunnel. We hadn't gone more than 50 yards when we found it, the landslide. The entire hillside had given way, probably triggered by the intensity of the rain, tons of mud and rock and splintered trees blocking what had been the trail. If we'd been on this path when it happened, if we'd tried to push through the storm instead of taking shelter, we would have been buried. Or if we'd made it past just before the slide, we'd be trapped on the other side now, cut off from the camp with no way back. My companion grabbed my arm, shouting something over the roar of the storm that I couldn't quite make out. We stood there in the rain, staring at the destruction, and I felt the bottom drop out of my stomach. Because the voice had been right. The voice had said to go left, and we'd gone right, and here was the proof that we should have listened, or was it? Maybe the slide had just happened, triggered by our movement above it, by the weight of our footsteps on already unstable ground. Maybe it would have happened regardless of which direction we'd chosen. Maybe the voice had nothing to do with it at all. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd been warned, that something in that tunnel had known what was waiting out here and had tried to steer us away from it. Something that could complete my sentences, that could answer my questions, that could speak with breath I could feel against my ear. We had to go back, had to return to the tunnel and try the other direction, see if there was another way out, another path back to camp. The alternative was staying out here in the storm, trying to climb over or around the landslide, risking another collapse or a fall that would leave us injured and stranded. So we turned around, fought our way back through the deluge, and ducked once more into the concrete throat of the tunnel. The silence was worse this time. Not actual silence. The storm still raged outside, water still dripped from the ceiling, but an absence, a void where something should have been. The tunnel felt different, emptier somehow, and I realized with a chill that spread from my spine to my fingertips that I was afraid of what I might find if I tested the echo again. But I had to know. Had to confirm that what I'd heard before was real, was something I could replicate, something I could show to my companion to prove I wasn't losing my mind. So I called out, my voice cracking slightly with an emotion I didn't want to name. The echo came back, but it was just an echo now. My own voice bounced back to me, slightly distorted by the acoustics of the tunnel. I tried again, asking the question more forcefully. Which way to camp? The echo returned, perfect and empty, giving me back exactly what I'd put in and nothing more. The tunnel was just a tunnel again, filled with graffiti and darkness and the detritus of decades of abandonment. Whatever had been there before, whatever had spoken to me with its warm breath in my ear, was gone. My companion was watching me with undisguised concern now, and I couldn't blame him. From his perspective, I'd panicked over nothing, dragged us back out into the storm, discovered a landslide that proved we should have stayed put, and now I was shouting questions at the walls like I expected them to answer. He suggested gently that maybe we should just wait out the storm here, try to preserve our phone batteries, and figure out a plan once we could see more than 5 feet in front of our faces. It was the sensible thing to do, the rational choice, and I hated how much sense it made because it meant staying in this tunnel, this space that had somehow gone from shelter to trap in the span of minutes. But I nodded, and we moved deeper inside, finding a spot where the ceiling didn't leak quite as badly, where we could sit with our backs against the wall and wait for the storm to pass. The minutes crawled by with the texture of hours. My companion dozed off eventually, exhausted from the hike and the adrenaline crash, but I couldn't sleep. I kept listening to the sounds of the tunnel, trying to separate the normal acoustic phenomena from anything else, from any hint that the voice might return. Every drip of water sounded deliberate. Every gust of wind through the entrance sounded like words forming in the darkness. Every shadow cast by our dying phone lights seemed to have depth and intention. I found myself wondering about the graffiti, about all those people who had come here before us, who had left their marks on these walls. Had any of them heard the voice? Was that what listen meant, written over and over until it disappeared into the crack? Had someone else stood here in this exact spot and experienced what I had experienced, and tried to warn others? Or was I constructing a narrative where none existed, seeing patterns in random noise, letting my imagination fill in the gaps left by exhaustion and fear and the disorienting effects of the storm? Maybe the voice had been my own subconscious, some part of my brain that had picked up on subtle cues about the terrain, about the instability of the hillside, and had manufactured a warning in a form I couldn't ignore. Maybe there was a psychological explanation for everything, a rational unpacking of cause and effect that would make the whole experience make sense. But then why had it felt so real? Why had I felt that breath, smelled that smell, heard that word spoken with such crystalline clarity? Why had the echo changed, shifted from simple reflection to something interactive, something that seemed to understand not just my words but my intent? The storm began to break as dawn approached, the thunder receding into the distance, the rain tapering from a deluge to a drizzle. My companion woke up, stiff and uncomfortable, and we gathered our things, preparing to try the other direction, to see if we could find a way around the landslide from the far end of the tunnel. The light from the entrance had shifted, morning sun beginning to burn through the clouds, and the tunnel seemed less threatening in its glow, more mundane, more explicable. We walked deeper in, past the point where the entrance light faded, using our phones to illuminate the crumbling concrete ahead. The tunnel went on longer than I'd expected, hundreds of yards at least, curving slightly so we couldn't see the far exit. More graffiti covered the walls here, darker and more cryptic, and I noticed a recurring symbol. 3 vertical lines with a horizontal line through them, like a tally mark crossed out, like something being negated or denied. And then my phone picked up the words, written small and precise in the same faded paint as the dates near the entrance. It answers because you're alone. I stopped, my light fixed on those 7 words, feeling my skin prickle with a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. My companion asked what I'd found, moving his light over to join mine, and together we read the message. He laughed it off, said it was probably just some kids trying to freak people out, but I couldn't shake the sensation that those words were meant specifically for me, written by someone who had stood in this tunnel and heard what I'd heard, and understood what it meant. Because that was the thing, wasn't it? I had been alone when the voice spoke. Not physically, my companion had been right there, but mentally, emotionally, cut off by his headphones and his music, isolated in the darkness while the storm raged outside. And the voice had known, had understood that isolation and used it, filled it, became the presence that the emptiness demanded. We found the far exit eventually, emerging onto an overgrown access road that wound its way down the mountain in the opposite direction from the landslide. It would be a longer walk back to camp, but it was a walk we could make, a path that was clear and safe. As we stepped out into the morning light, I looked back at the tunnel one last time, at the darkness that filled its throat despite the sun, at the entrance that seemed to be watching us leave. And I could swear, though I can't prove it and never will, that I heard something from deep inside. Not an echo, not a voice, but something between the two. A sound that might have been words, might have been just the wind, might have been my imagination supplying what I expected to hear. But it sounded impossibly like it was saying goodbye. We made it back to camp 3 hours later, exhausted and muddy but alive. My companion told the story of the landslide, of our narrow escape, of how lucky we'd been to find shelter. I didn't mention the voice, didn't mention the way the echo had changed, or the breath I'd felt, or the words written on the wall deep in the darkness. What would be the point? Either it had been real, and was therefore impossible to explain, or it had been in my head, and was therefore even more impossible to explain. But sometimes, in the weeks and months that followed, I found myself listening to the spaces between sounds, to the way words echoed in empty rooms, to the quality of my own voice when I was alone. And sometimes, just sometimes, I heard something that shouldn't be there. A completion, an answer, a presence filling the vacuum of isolation. And I wondered if the tunnel had given me something, or if it had revealed something that had always been there, waiting in the spaces between myself and the world, in the silence between words, in the darkness that persists, even when we think we've brought light. I wondered if I would ever truly be alone again, or if that third voice would always be there, just at the edge of hearing, waiting for the right moment to answer the questions I hadn't yet asked. I wondered, and I listened, and I tried not to think about what it meant that sometimes, in the deepest part of the night, the echo still came back wrong. Story 7. The cold doesn't bother me anymore. 12 seasons working the Adelaide, a restored 19th century brigantine that ferries tourists through the North Atlantic, and I've learned to feel the ice in my bones before it appears on the rigging. That particular November crossing from Nova Scotia toward the Newfoundland coast, though, that cold felt different. It came from somewhere deeper than wind or water. I was alone in the chart room when it happened. The passengers had retired below deck after dinner, their laughter and rum-warmed voices fading into the wooden belly of the ship. The captain, old Torben, a Norwegian with 40 years at sea, had gone to check the rigging with the first mate. I'd volunteered to update the navigational log, a task I'd performed hundreds of times without incident. The chart room sat at the stern, a cramped space lined with mahogany cabinets and brass instruments that gleamed in the lamplight. A large slate board hung on the wall, where we marked coordinates, weather conditions, and course corrections in chalk. The scratch of chalk on slate had become a meditation for me over the years, a ritual that anchored me to the present moment. I had just finished noting our position, 47°32 N, 54°18 W, when the temperature in the room dropped. Not gradually, the way it does when someone opens a door to winter air, but instantly, as if I'd stepped into a meat locker. My breath crystallized in front of my face. The lamp flame stuttered and stretched thin, casting shadows that seemed to reach for me. I looked up from the slate. A man sat at the captain's desk. He wore a pea coat dark with moisture, and his hair was plastered to his skull as if he'd just come in from a storm. Water didn't drip from him. It clung, frozen in rivulets along his collar and sleeves. His face was turned away from me, toward the porthole that looked out on the black Atlantic, and his right hand moved across a piece of paper I couldn't see, though I heard the scratch of something writing. Every muscle in my body locked. The logical part of my mind scrambled for explanations. A passenger who'd gotten lost, one of the crew playing a prank, but that part was drowning under a wave of primal certainty that whoever this was, he shouldn't be here. Couldn't be here. I'd secured the door myself when I'd entered. I tried to speak, to call out, but my throat had closed. The scratching continued. Then he turned his head. I didn't see his face. I can't explain that adequately. It's not that shadows obscured his features, or that I looked away. I saw where his face should be, my eyes focused on that space, but my mind refused to process what it received. Like trying to remember a dream that dissolves the moment you wake. He raised his left hand and pointed at the slate board. Then he stood, walked past me. I felt the cold radiate from him, smelled brine and something else, something chemical and wrong, and moved toward the door I knew was locked. I heard it open. The hinges creaked. The door closed again. I blinked. The captain's desk was empty. The chair sat exactly as it had been. No water on the seat. No paper on the writing surface. The lamp burned steady, but on the slate board, below my coordinates, someone had written in chalk, Northwest heading. The letters were large, deliberate, each one carved deep enough into the slate that I could see the grooves from across the room. The handwriting wasn't mine. I stared at those words for what might have been seconds or minutes, my heart hammering against my ribs, before I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Torben entered, bringing with him the smell of tar and tobacco. He glanced at me, then at the board, and frowned. "You change our course?" he asked. His English carried the melodic lilt of Bergen. I opened my mouth, closed it, opened it again. "What do you say? That a ghost wrote navigational instructions? That I just witnessed something that violated every natural law I'd built my adult life around?" "Thought I saw something," I finally managed. "On the radar earlier, wanted to note it for the log." It was a lie that tasted like ash. Torben studied me for a long moment, his pale blue eyes unreadable, then nodded. He'd been at sea long enough to know that certain things don't get discussed openly, that some experiences live in the spaces between official reports. "We're ahead of schedule," he said slowly. "An hour northwest won't hurt us. If your instinct says to look, we look." I wanted to tell him it wasn't instinct, that I had no rational explanation for what I'd seen, or why we should follow instructions from a presence that couldn't exist. But I also felt a pull toward that heading, like an undertow beneath calm water. Something wanted us to go northwest, or something knew we needed to. We adjusted our course. The next 2 hours passed in agonizing normalcy. I stayed on deck, unable to face the enclosed spaces below, watching the dark water and darker sky merge into a single void. The wind picked up, bringing with it particles of ice that stung exposed skin. Our running lights barely penetrated the blackness ahead. Then the lookout shouted. At first, I couldn't make sense of what the searchlight revealed. A shape emerged from the darkness like a photograph developing in chemicals. White and angular, too geometric to be ice, but too irregular to be deliberate. As we drew closer, the shape resolved into a vessel, a fishing trawler caught in the grip of pack ice, listing heavily to starboard. Torben maneuvered the Adelaide as close as he dared while the crew prepared rescue lines. The trawler showed no lights, no signs of life, and for several horrible minutes I convinced myself we'd found a tomb, that whatever had written that message had led us to witness something unspeakable. Then a figure appeared on the trawler's deck. Then another. 4 men total, moving like sleepwalkers, their survival suits bright orange against the ice. They barely responded to our calls, but they managed to secure the lines. We brought them aboard one by one, their faces so pinched with cold and exhaustion that they barely looked human. The captain of the trawler, a Portuguese man named Vasco, whose lips were cracked and bleeding, could barely speak at first. We wrapped him in blankets, forced hot soup into him, waited while his body remembered how to function. The other 3 men sat in the galley in complete silence, staring at nothing, occasionally trembling despite the warmth. When Vasco finally spoke, his voice was a rasp that hurt to hear. 3 days, he said. We were caught 3 days ago. Radio dead. Engine dead. We thought... He broke off, shaking his head. We thought this was it. Torben asked him about the ice, about what had happened to their equipment. Practical questions that had practical answers. But I found myself watching the 4th man, the youngest of the group, who sat apart from the others with his hands pressed flat against the galley table as if anchoring himself to something solid. This man, I learned later his name was Duarte, kept looking at me. Not casual glances, but sustained, intense stares that made my skin crawl. Finally, he spoke directly to me, ignoring everyone else in the room. I know you, he said. The galley went quiet. Torben stopped mid-question. Vasco turned to look at his crewman with an expression of concern that bordered on fear. No, I said carefully. We've never met. Not here, Duarte insisted. His eyes had a feverish quality, too bright in his exhausted face. I saw you. 3 nights ago I fell asleep while we were trapped and I had a dream. But it wasn't a dream. It was too real, too clear. I saw a room made of wood, old wood, with brass instruments and maps. There was a black board on the wall, and I saw myself sitting at a desk, writing something, and when I turned around... He stopped abruptly, his throat working. When you turned around, I prompted, though I didn't want to hear the answer. I saw you, he whispered, standing exactly where you're standing now, looking at me the same way. And I was writing on that blackboard. I wrote directions. A course. Northwest. His hand started to shake on the table. When I woke up, I told Vasco we'd be found. I knew it. I knew someone was coming from the southeast, and they'd find us if we could just survive one more night. But I didn't know how I knew. The galley remained silent except for the creak of the ship and the distant howl of wind. No one seemed to know how to respond to this. Vasco touched Duarte's shoulder gently, murmured something in Portuguese about rest and shock, about how the mind does strange things under extreme duress. But I felt something crack inside my chest, like ice breaking. Because Duarte had described the chart room perfectly, a room he'd never seen, on a ship he'd never boarded until tonight. And he described me standing in that exact spot, watching something that hadn't happened, or something that was happening, or something that would happen. I excused myself, claiming I needed to check the rigging, and stumbled out onto the deck. The cold air hit me like a fist, but I welcomed it, needed it to clear my head. I gripped the rail and stared out at the darkness, trying to force the pieces of this impossible puzzle into some shape that made sense. Time moved strangely on ships. I knew that. The endless watch cycles, the disorientation of living in a wooden box surrounded by infinity, it could play tricks on perception, on memory. But this wasn't a trick. Duarte had described something specific, something he couldn't have known. And that presence in the chart room, that figure made of cold and wrong angles, had written directions that led us exactly where we needed to be. Had led, or would lead, or was leading. I squeezed my eyes shut, but that only made it worse. In the darkness behind my eyelids, I saw the chart room again, saw that figure at the captain's desk, felt the temperature drop and the lamplight waver. But this time, when the figure turned, I saw its face. It was Duarte. No, it was me. No, it was both of us somehow, occupying the same impossible space, writing messages to ourselves across time or dimension, or some barrier that my rational mind refused to acknowledge. I opened my eyes and vomited over the rail. We reached port 2 days later. The rescued fishermen were transferred to a hospital for observation, though they seemed physically recovered. Duarte kept staring at me whenever our paths crossed, and I found myself avoiding him, unable to bear the recognition in his eyes. On our final morning in port, I went to the chart room to collect my personal effects. The room smelled of wood and brass polish, utterly normal in the daylight streaming through the porthole. I looked at the slate board where I'd written our coordinates that night, where the message had appeared in chalk strokes that weren't mine. The board was clean, not wiped clean. I could always tell when someone had erased chalk, could see the ghost of previous marks in the grain. This was pristine, as if nothing had ever been written there at all, as if the chalk dust had never existed, had never fallen in a fine white powder to collect in the board's wooden tray. I ran my fingers over the slate's surface, searching for the grooves those deep strokes must have left. The surface was smooth, unmarked, virgin. In the captain's desk drawer, I found a logbook, not ours. This was older, water-damaged, its pages stiff with dried salt. I opened it carefully. The handwriting was cramped and hurried, but legible. The final entry, dated 17 years earlier, described a vessel encountering pack ice near Newfoundland. The writer, the captain I assumed, mentioned strange occurrences, equipment failures, disorientation among the crew, a feeling of being watched. The entry ended mid-sentence. I saw someone in my cabin tonight, writing at my desk. When I approached, they turned and I recognized the rest of the page had been torn out. I checked the ship's name on the logbook's cover. It meant nothing to me. But clipped to the inside front cover was a photograph, old and faded, showing a crew of 7 men standing on a dock. I recognized the vessel behind them, a fishing trawler similar to the one we'd rescued. The young man on the far left was Vasco, but the photograph had been taken in 2008, 17 years ago, and Vasco hadn't looked 17. He'd looked exactly as old as he'd looked when we pulled him from the ice. I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Without thinking, I slipped the logbook into my coat and left the chart room, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might crack my ribs. I never asked Torben about the logbook, never showed it to anyone. I kept it in a waterproof case in my apartment, where it sits now as I write this, a physical object that proves nothing and everything simultaneously. Last week I took a job on a different vessel, a modern catamaran running Caribbean tours. I told myself I needed a change, warmer waters, simpler work. But the truth is, I couldn't face another Atlantic crossing, couldn't risk entering that chart room again on a cold November night, because I think I understand now what happened. Or rather, I understand that I'll never understand, and that might be worse. I think time isn't a line on those dark waters. I think it's something else, something that folds back on itself in ways we're not meant to perceive. I think Duarte and I shared a moment that existed simultaneously in multiple places, multiple times, and we both played the same role, the one who writes the message and the one who receives it. But here's what keeps me awake now, what makes me check over my shoulder in empty rooms. If I wrote that message, then I was the figure I saw. And if I was the figure, then I couldn't see my own face because I was looking at myself from the outside. And if that's true, then somewhere, sometime, there's a version of me who will sit at that captain's desk and write those words in chalk, already knowing they'll save 4 lives, already knowing that the act of writing them will trap me in a loop I can't escape, already knowing that I've done this before and I'll do it again, reaching back across the dark to guide myself to where I need to be. The logbook's final page has a sentence I haven't shown anyone. The man at my desk was me, and I was watching myself write this. Below it, in different handwriting, my handwriting, though I've never written in that book, are coordinates: 47 dig 32N, 54 dig 18W. Exactly where we were the night I saw the figure in the chart room. I haven't checked those coordinates against current navigational charts. I'm afraid of what I'll find there, or what will find me. Because sometimes, late at night, I feel chalk dust on my fingers, though I haven't touched chalk in months. And I smell brine and something chemical and wrong. And I know, with a certainty that terrifies me, that somewhere out there in the dark Atlantic, someone is writing my coordinates on a slate board. Or I am, or we both are, reaching for each other across a distance that can't be measured in miles or years, trying desperately to complete a loop that may have no beginning and no end. The cold doesn't bother me anymore, but the writing does. Story 8. The canyon air tasted like copper and dust when we arrived, the kind of metallic tang that coats your throat and refuses to leave. My buddy, let's call him Rake, everyone did, wanted to catch the sunrise from the rim, said it would be worth the drive. I should have known better than to trust a man who navigates by intuition and gas station coffee. We parked on a jutting plateau, where the earth simply ended, giving way to a 1,000-foot drop of striated red rock that looked like the ribs of something long dead. The silence up there wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own pulse, your own breathing, the small mechanical sounds of your body that you usually ignore. Below us, the canyon floor was already swallowed by shadow, though the sun still painted the upper cliffs in shades of rust and amber. Rake fell asleep almost immediately in the driver's seat, his snoring cutting through the stillness with the regularity of a metronome. I tried to follow suit in the back, but sleep came in fits and starts. The car groaned and ticked as it cooled, metal contracting in the dropping temperature. Every sound seemed amplified, the whisper of wind through the scrub brush, the distant cry of something that might have been a bird, or might have been the canyon itself breathing. I must have dozed eventually because I woke to complete darkness. The kind of dark you only find far from civilization, where the stars are so dense they look like spilled salt, and cast almost no light at all. My neck ached from the awkward angle against the door, and my mouth was dry as sand. That's when I heard it, or rather, felt it, the subtle shift of air pressure that comes when something passes close by. The sound came next, a soft scraping, deliberate and rhythmic, like fingernails on glass. I opened my eyes but didn't move, couldn't move. Through the window, inches from my face, I could make out the silhouette of hands, 2 of them, pressed against the glass from the outside, slowly working their way into the small gap at the top of the window. The hands were wrong, too rough, the knuckles too pronounced, the nails dark crescents that caught what little light existed. They moved with purpose, fingers flexing and probing, testing the barrier between outside and in. Then a forehead pressed against the glass. The condensation bloomed instantly, small circles of fog that expanded and contracted in rhythm with breathing that was too slow, too measured. Through the vapor, I could see the outline of a face, or what should have been a face. The features were there but indistinct, like looking at someone through wax paper. The breathing continued, steady as a clock, each exhalation leaving its mark on the window. I counted. 1 breath. 2. 3. I counted to keep from screaming, to keep from moving, because some ancient part of my brain understood that stillness meant survival. Rake kept snoring in the front seat, oblivious. The hands continued their exploration of the window's edge, sometimes disappearing from view, sometimes returning with renewed interest. At 27 breaths, they slid away, leaving behind smears on the glass that looked like grease or sweat. I waited, counted to 100 before I sat up, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my teeth. Rake was still asleep, his mouth open, completely vulnerable. I reached forward and grabbed his shoulder, shaking him harder than necessary. He jerked awake with a snort, eyes wild in the darkness. I told him we were leaving. Now. He started to argue, something about the sunrise, about driving tired, but whatever he saw in my face shut him up. We were on the road in under 2 minutes, the headlights carving tunnels through the black desert landscape. Neither of us spoke for the first 20 miles. The road unwound beneath us, empty and endless. I kept checking the rearview mirror, though for what I couldn't say. The darkness behind us looked the same as the darkness ahead, broken only by our taillights painting the road red. The first gas station we found squatted beside the highway like something that had crawled there to die. Fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered over two lonely pumps. A sign promised hot coffee and clean restrooms, both probable lies. My stomach had twisted itself into knots, and a cold sweat had broken out across my forehead despite the desert heat that was already building with the approaching dawn. I asked the attendant, a weathered woman with eyes that had seen too much highway and not enough sleep, for ice. She looked at me the way you look at roadkill, with that mixture of pity and revulsion, and pointed toward a freezer in the back. When I returned to the car, Rake was standing outside the passenger door, staring at the window where I'd been sleeping. The mark was still there. The condensation had dried, but it left behind something else, a residue of oils and dirt, and something organic that created a perfect impression in the glass. You could see the texture of skin, the whorls and ridges, like a gigantic fingerprint left by a forehead pressed too close for too long. The pattern was intricate, impossibly detailed, pores and fine lines captured in the grime. I should have photographed it. That's what you do in moments like this, right? Document the evidence, prove to yourself and others that it happened. But I couldn't. Some instinct warned me against creating a permanent record, as if capturing the image might give it power, might make it more real than it already was. Rake suggested we clean it off. I told him no, not yet, though I couldn't explain why. We got back on the road as the sun finally breached the horizon, flooding the desert with light that should have felt reassuring but didn't. The next 3 days passed in a blur of highway motels and truck stop diners. We didn't talk about it. Rake wanted to, I could tell. He kept starting sentences that died before completion, kept glancing at me like I might provide answers I didn't have. But what was there to say? Someone, something, had been at the car. The evidence was right there on the glass, a ghostly testament that refused to evaporate no matter how many times the sun baked it or the wind scoured it. I started noticing things, small things at first, the way shadows seemed to linger in my peripheral vision, resolving into nothing when I looked directly. The sensation of being watched that crept up my spine in empty parking lots and quiet hallways. I'd wake in the middle of the night, convinced I'd heard breathing that wasn't mine, that wasn't Rake's, only to find the room empty and ordinary. On the fourth night, in a motel somewhere in New Mexico where the walls were thin and the air conditioning wheezed like an asthmatic, I woke to find Rake standing at the window. His back was to me, silhouetted against the orange glow of the parking lot lights. He was completely still, his forehead pressed against the glass, his hands raised and pressed flat against the window on either side of his face. The position was familiar, horribly familiar. I said his name, but he didn't respond. I said it again, louder, and he turned slowly, like someone moving underwater. His eyes were open but unfocused, and when he spoke, his voice was thick with sleep. He asked what was wrong, said he'd just been looking outside, couldn't sleep. But I'd seen how he was standing, seen the exact mimicry of that night at the canyon. When I pointed it out, he looked confused, then defensive. Said I was being paranoid, that I was seeing patterns where there were none, that maybe I should see someone when we got back home. The concern in his voice was genuine, which made it worse somehow. The next morning, I checked the window where he'd been standing. There was a mark, faint but unmistakable, the same kind of residue, the same impression of a forehead pressed too close, surrounded by handprints on either side. I didn't mention it to Rake. What would be the point? To prove what, exactly? That something had followed us from the canyon, or that whatever happened that night had infected us somehow, spreading like a contagion through proximity and fear. We made it home on the 6th day. Rake dropped me off at my apartment with a handshake that felt like goodbye, like he was washing his hands of me and whatever weirdness had attached itself to our trip. I couldn't blame him. I wanted to do the same. But it didn't stop. I'd find marks on my windows some mornings, never all of them, never predictable, always the same pattern, forehead, hands, sometimes on the bedroom window, sometimes the bathroom, once on the sliding glass door that led to my balcony. I'd clean them obsessively, scrubbing until my hands were raw, but they'd reappear. I stopped sleeping near windows, started keeping the blinds closed day and night, installed additional locks that I knew rationally would do nothing to stop whatever this was. Because it wasn't about breaking in, was it? It was about proximity, about pressing close, about that slow, measured breathing on the other side of glass. The worst part wasn't the marks themselves. It was the uncertainty. Had I seen something real in the canyon that night? Or had my half-asleep mind conjured a nightmare from shadows and wind? Was Rake sleepwalking? Or had something compelled him to recreate that position? Were the marks on my windows proof of an external presence, or evidence that I was creating them myself in fugue states I couldn't remember? I caught myself once, in the middle of the night, standing at my bedroom window with my hands raised. I snapped awake, if that's what it was, with my forehead almost touching the glass, my breath creating small clouds of condensation. The urge to press closer was overwhelming, like an itch I desperately needed to scratch. I forced myself backward, away from the window, my heart racing. The marks continued. Some mornings I'd wake with dirt under my fingernails, dark crescents like the hands I'd seen that first night. I'd scrub them clean, but the image lingered, making me question whose hands I'd really seen in the canyon. Mine, Rake's, or something else entirely. I drove back to the canyon once, 3 months later. Told myself it was for closure, but I think I was hoping for proof. Evidence that would tilt the balance definitively toward real or imagined. The spot was easy to find, the same jutting plateau where we'd parked. I arrived at sunset, watched the shadows creep up from the canyon floor like rising water. When full darkness came, I waited in the car, windows cracked, breathing shallow. The silence was the same, that oppressive quiet that made you aware of your own existence. I counted my breaths, matching the rhythm I remembered from that night. 1, 2, 3. At breath 27, I felt the air pressure shift. I didn't look. Kept my eyes straight ahead, fixed on the windshield where the first stars were beginning to appear. But I could feel it. Presence, intent, something paying attention. The urge to turn, to look, to press my face against the glass was almost unbearable. I counted to 100, then started the car and drove away. The marks still appear on my windows. Less frequently now, or maybe I've just stopped noticing them. I've learned to live with the uncertainty, with the not knowing. Sometimes I catch myself standing at windows in the middle of the night, hands raised, forehead close to the glass, and I force myself away before contact. But sometimes, and this is what keeps me awake more than anything, sometimes I don't catch myself in time. And on those mornings, when I wake in my bed with no memory of the night before, I find the marks on the outside of my windows, where I couldn't possibly have made them, unless, of course, I've been on the outside all along. And what I think of as waking is just another form of pressing close, breathing slowly, counting the breaths of the thing that sleeps in my bed while I stand at the window with my rough hands and dark nails, waiting for the moment when inside and outside finally blur beyond distinction. I don't check the mirrors as carefully as I used to. I'm afraid of what texture I might see in my own fingerprints, what patterns my own forehead might leave in the fog. Story 9. The cold up here doesn't feel like cold anymore. It becomes something else. A presence that presses against your skin, seeps through every layer of synthetic fiber and down, settles into your bones like it's been waiting there all along. After 3 days on the North Face, I'd stopped feeling my fingertips as separate things. They were just distant provinces of sensation, reporting back through the static of exhaustion. We'd made good time that third day. My climbing partner, I'll call him Reed, though that wasn't his name, not really, had found a serviceable ledge wide enough for both tents by late afternoon. The weather window was holding, which in January on this face qualified as a minor miracle. By 8 p.m., we'd melted enough snow for dinner, and the morning, checked and rechecked our gear with the ritualistic paranoia that keeps you alive at altitude, and sealed ourselves into our separate nylon cocoons. The tent fabric snapped and whispered in the wind like something alive. I'd learned to sleep through it years ago, the way you learn to sleep through traffic or a neighbor's television. It becomes part of the silence somehow. White noise at 15 below zero. My breathing slowed. The sleeping bag compressed around me, a warm coffin. Sleep came in layers, shallow at first, then deeper, the kind of depth where your body finally stops shivering and surrenders to the cold. I don't know what woke me. Not at first. My watch glowed 2:07 a.m. when I finally thought to check it. But by then, I was already sitting up, heart hammering, the sleeping bag half unzipped. The sound came again, and this time I was conscious enough to register it properly. A voice. A single word called out from somewhere below our position, from the direction we'd ascended. Hey. Not shouted, not weak either. Just conversational. The tone you'd use to get someone's attention across a room. I held my breath, listening. The wind had died completely. I noticed that now. The tent fabric hung still. In the absolute silence of a winter mountain at night, that single syllable seemed to hover in the air, impossibly clear. My first thought was that Reed had gone out to piss and called to me for some reason, but I could hear him breathing in his tent 3 feet away, the deep, steady rhythm of someone unconscious. Another climber then. Had to be. Someone in trouble, maybe. Or just another team passing through. Except nobody climbs this route in January. Nobody. That's why we'd chosen it. The rational part of my brain, the part trained by a decade of big walls and winter ascents, started running through possibilities. Sound does strange things at altitude. I'd heard voices before that turned out to be wind through rock formations, ice shifting, even my own pulse pounding in my ears. But this had been words, clear, human. I fumbled for my headlamp, found it, didn't turn it on. Through the tent's mesh panel, I could see a faint glow outside, not dawn, wrong angle for that, wrong color. Yellowish, moving slightly, the way a lantern would move if someone was holding it. Too high off the ground for a headlamp, too steady for a chemical light stick. My hands were shaking as I unzipped the tent. Not from cold. I'd like to say it was from cold, but I knew better even then. Some part of me already understood that something was wrong, fundamentally wrong, in a way that had nothing to do with weather, or equipment failure, or any of the normal dangers you prepare for. The air outside hit my face like a slap, clear, brutally cold, and so still it felt solid. And there, maybe 50 feet down the slope, was the light, hanging in empty air, swaying gently. The yellow glow illuminated nothing, no rock face, no person holding it, just a sphere of dirty gold suspended against the darkness like a paper lantern at a festival. I watched it sway, back and forth, hypnotic. Hey, it called again, and the sound came from the light itself, or from where the light was, and I realized with a clarity that made my throat close that there was no one there. Just the light. Just that golden glow bobbing in the void, waiting. I should have gone back into the tent. Should have woken Reed. Should have done anything except what I did, which was respond. The word came out of me before I could stop it, automatic as breathing, the social contract of call and response operating on pure instinct. Yeah? The light moved, pulled back, receded a few feet down the slope, then stopped, waiting. The motion was unmistakable. Follow me. I took a step forward. My boot crunched on wind-hardened snow, loud as a gunshot in the stillness. The light bobbed once, encouragingly, and began to retreat again, slowly, maintaining that same 50-foot distance, leading me down, back the way we'd come, into the dark. Another step. The rational part of my mind was screaming now, but it was distant, overwhelmed by something else. Curiosity maybe, or compulsion, or the simple animal response to follow light in darkness. My hand reached for my ice axe. Behind me, very close, barely a whisper. "Hey." My voice. My exact voice. The way it sounded in my own head, not the way it sounds on recordings. The voice that no one else ever hears. Coming from my tent, from where Reed was sleeping. I froze, turned my head. Through the tent mesh I could just make out his shape in the sleeping bag, completely still, not sitting up, not moving at all, but that voice had been mine. And it had come from exactly where he was. The light ahead of me brightened, pulsed once, impatient. Every survival instinct I'd ever developed was firing at once. Contradictory signals crashing into each other. Run, stay, follow, hide. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else. The cold didn't matter anymore. My breath came in short gasps that crystallized in the air, little clouds of panic. I looked at the light, looked at the tent. The light bobbed again, beckoning. Inside the tent, nothing moved, but I could still hear that breathing, steady and deep, human in a way that made my skin crawl because I couldn't be sure, couldn't be absolutely certain, that it was Reed in there at all. The decision to step backward instead of forward might be the only reason I'm telling this story. It felt like moving through concrete, every muscle fighting me, but I forced myself to turn away from the light, to turn my back on it, to walk the 3 steps to my tent, climb inside, and zip it shut with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. I didn't sleep. Couldn't. I lay there in the darkness listening to Reed breathe in the tent next to mine, listening for any sound from outside, any indication of movement. The light. I could still see it through the mesh, dimly, growing fainter by degrees until it was gone. Or I thought it was gone. Maybe I closed my eyes. Time did strange things in that tent. Stretching and compressing, hours that felt like minutes, minutes that felt like hours. When dawn finally came, real dawn, gray and grudging, I was still awake. I heard Reed stirring, heard the zip of his bag, the rustle of fabric, normal sounds, human sounds. I waited for him to call out a greeting, to ask how I'd slept, something. He didn't. Just the sounds of him preparing for the day, methodical and unhurried. I forced myself out of the tent. Reed was already up, boiling water, his back to me. He turned when he heard me emerge, and his face was exactly as it always was, slightly wind-burned, stubbled, neutral. Nothing in his eyes suggested that anything unusual had happened. Nothing at all. I almost asked him, almost said, "Did you call out last night? Did you hear anything? Did you leave your tent?" But the words stuck in my throat because what if he said no? What if he looked at me like I was crazy? Or worse, what if he said yes? Instead, I went to where I'd seen the light, where it had hung in the air, impossible and beckoning. The snow there was undisturbed except for one patch, maybe 2 feet across, where the surface ice had a strange quality. Slick. Not like frozen water, but like oil, catching the weak morning light and throwing it back in rainbow patterns. When I knelt to touch it, the texture was wrong. Too smooth. Too warm. My glove came away with a residue that I couldn't identify, couldn't explain. Reed called out that we should get moving, make use of the weather. His voice was normal, concerned only with the climb. I wiped my glove on the snow and said nothing about the patch of ice, about the light, about any of it. We broke camp with the efficiency of long practice, roped up, and continued our ascent. But I couldn't stop looking back. The climb itself was technically straightforward, which gave me too much time to think. Reed led most of the pitches that day. I blamed it on fatigue, said I hadn't slept well, which was true enough. He didn't question it. Good partners don't, not on a serious route. You trust each other's judgment. You have to. Except I couldn't stop watching him. The way he moved, the way he clipped into protection points, the way he called out rope signals. Everything was correct. Everything was Reed. But the doubt had planted itself, burrowing deep, and I couldn't dig it out. That voice in the darkness, using my voice, coming from his tent. What if something had answered when I called back? What if something had gotten in? By midday, we'd gained another 1,000 feet. The summit ridge was visible above us, a cruel promise of proximity. 3 more days, maybe 4 if the weather held. Reed seemed pleased with our progress. He smiled when he said we might actually pull this off, and the smile was exactly right, exactly his, which somehow made it worse. That night I didn't sleep at all. Lay in my bag listening, waiting. Nothing came. No voice, no light, just wind, normal wind, and the sound of Reed sleeping soundly while I stared at tent fabric and questioned everything I thought I knew about reality. The pattern repeated, day after day. Climb, make camp, lie awake. Reed never mentioned my deteriorating state, though he must have noticed. I was moving slower, making stupid mistakes, forgetting to clip in. Dangerous mistakes. He covered for me, took on more of the load, and never asked why. Maybe he knew. Maybe he was waiting for me to bring it up. Or maybe, and this thought was the worst, maybe he was just being patient, waiting for me to trust him enough to follow, to step out into the darkness when the next call came. On the 6th night, at high camp, one push from the summit, I finally broke. Reed was in his tent, zipped in, and I sat outside mine in the dark, no headlamp, just sitting in the cold, waiting, testing. "Hey," I said quietly, not loud, just loud enough. The wind answered, nothing else. Minutes passed. The dark stayed dark. Then, from far below, from the void beneath the mountain, "Yeah?" My voice, clear as day, waiting down there in the black. I didn't go into my tent. I crawled into Reed's instead, woke him up, and told him everything. The light, the voice, the oil-slick ice, the growing certainty that something was wrong, that something had followed us up, or was still down there, or had always been here. I talked until I was hoarse, until my throat ached from the cold, dry air, and he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he told me about the first night, the one before I woke up, how he'd heard footsteps circling the tents, how he'd looked out and seen nothing, but the footsteps had continued, crunching in the snow around and around for hours, how he'd convinced himself it was ice shifting, wind, anything but what it sounded like. We summited the next morning in silence. The view was everything we'd hoped for. Endless peaks, the curve of the earth. That crystalline clarity you only get above 20,000 feet. We took the obligatory photos, shook hands, and started down. Neither of us mentioned that we were moving faster than we should, that we were taking risks with the descent we'd never normally take. We just wanted off that mountain. The descent took 3 days. We didn't stop at the ledge where it started. Didn't even slow down. We rappelled past it at dusk, and in the fading light I saw it. That patch of ice, bigger now, spreading. The oil-slick sheen unmistakable even from above. And something in the ice. Dark shapes moving beneath the surface, or the illusion of movement, or Reed's voice from below. Off rappel. I didn't look again. We reached base camp on a Tuesday, made it to the road by Wednesday. Back to cell service, electricity, the mundane salvation of civilization. We shook hands in the parking lot, promised to stay in touch, and drove away in opposite directions. I haven't spoken to him since. Sometimes late at night my phone rings, no caller ID. When I answer, and I always answer, I can't help it. There's nothing, just silence. And very faintly, if I listen hard enough, that sound. Fabric snapping in the wind, and breathing, steady and deep. I think about calling Reed, asking him if it happens to him too, but I'm afraid of 2 possibilities equally, that he'll say yes, or that he won't know what I'm talking about, that he never heard footsteps that first night, that I was alone in my tent, alone with the thing that learned to copy my voice. Last week I found something in my gear bag while packing for a new climb, tucked into a pocket I never use. A small Ziploc with ice inside, still frozen, still solid, despite being at room temperature for months. The ice has that sheen, that oil slick quality, And when I hold it up to the light, I swear I can see something moving in there. Something that knows I'm watching. I'm going back. Have to. The question isn't why. I couldn't explain that to anyone, barely understand it myself. Some things demand answers, even when you know the answer will destroy you. I've planned the route, packed the gear. I'm going alone this time. Can't risk bringing anyone else. Maybe I'll find out what called to me that night. Maybe I'll understand why it used my voice, what it wanted, what it still wants. Maybe I'll even find Reed up there, if he went back too, if he couldn't help himself either. Or maybe I'll just find a light in the darkness, swaying gently, waiting to lead me down into something that has no name. I leave tomorrow at dawn. If you're reading this and I don't come back, don't look for me. Don't go to that mountain. And if you're somewhere cold and dark, and you hear someone call your name in a voice that sounds just like yours, don't answer. Whatever you do, don't answer. Story 10. The water was glass that evening, the kind of stillness that makes you whisper, even when there's no one around to hear. I'd brought my dog to Cascade Lake 3 times before, and each time he'd dug his claws into the dirt and refused to go near the shore. But that sunset in late September, something changed. The moment we crested the trail and the lake came into view, mercury smooth and bleeding orange from the dying light, he bolted, not toward the water exactly, but as if something had yanked an invisible leash wrapped around his chest. I called after him, but my voice felt swallowed by the trees pressing close on all sides. The forest on Orcas Island grows different than mainland woods, denser. The Douglas firs lean inward like they're trying to keep secrets, and the underbrush rustles even when there's no wind. By the time I reached the rocky beach, my dog was already chest-deep, paddling in frantic circles. His eyes were white-rimmed, showing too much of that pink membrane that dogs get when they're terrified. The thing was, he wasn't swimming away from shore. He was swimming away from something in the water. I waded in up to my knees, the cold biting through my jeans, and grabbed his collar. He was shaking so hard I could feel it through his wet fur, a tremor that seemed to run deeper than muscle, like something vibrating his bones from the inside. When I dragged him back to the beach, he didn't fight me. He just kept staring at the water, and the sound coming from his throat wasn't a growl or a whimper, but something in between, a sustained, questioning note that raised the hair on my forearms. That's when I saw the log. It floated about 20 feet out, parallel to the shore. I'd noticed it before, or thought I had. One of those waterlogged pieces of driftwood that bob in the shallows, too heavy to wash up but too buoyant to sink. Except I could swear it hadn't been there a moment ago. And as I watched, trying to convince myself I'd simply missed it before, the log shifted. Not with the current. There was no current. The lake was still holding its breath. The movement was subtle, a rotation maybe, or an adjustment of weight. I stood there with lake water filling my shoes, my dog pressed against my shins, still making that awful sound. And I watched the log breathe. I know how that sounds. Logs don't breathe. But I saw the water line change, saw the way the surface tension broke and reformed around what I'd taken for a knot in the wood. Closer now. Or had it drifted closer? The perspective was wrong somehow. I realized the knot was a snout. Narrow and elongated, covered in a mat of algae so thick it looked like hair. And above it, set deep in what might have been a skull, 2 eyes. They didn't blink. They didn't need to. They were already watching me. The distance between us collapsed in my perception. 20 feet became 2, became less than that, and I could see the film covering the irises. Gray, like cataracts, but wrong. The film moved independent of the eye beneath, a membrane that pulsed with its own rhythm. And below the surface, I swear I saw this, a dark mass suspended in the water. Too large to be what I was looking at, too undefined to comprehend. A voice reached me from across the lake. 2 kayakers, their bright yellow hulls cutting through the perfect mirror of the water, waving at me from what seemed like another dimension. I raised my hand automatically, and when I looked back, the log was gone. Not sinking, not drifting, just gone, like it had never existed. The water had sealed over the space it occupied without a ripple, without a bubble, without any evidence that something had just been there breathing and watching and understanding exactly what it was looking at. I didn't go back to Cascade Lake for 3 months. During that time, I told myself I'd been tired. The September light plays tricks on orcas, especially near sunset when the angle hits the water just wrong. I'd been working long hours at the rental property I managed on the island's east side, dealing with a backed-up septic system and a family of raccoons that had decided the crawl space was prime real estate. Stress and exhaustion make the brain do strange things, manufacture patterns where none exist, assign meaning to random stimuli. But my dog wouldn't eat for 4 days after that evening. And when he finally did, he'd flinch at the sound of running water, the sink, the shower, even rain on the roof. The vet found nothing wrong with him. Blood work normal, no signs of trauma or infection. She suggested anxiety medication, asked if anything had changed in our routine. I didn't mention the lake. What would I have said? The dream started in October. Always the same. I'm underwater, but breathing, suspended in green dimness, and something is circling me. Not a shark, not a fish. Something that moves like it's deciding whether I'm worth the effort. I can feel the displacement of water as it passes, the pressure wave pushing against my skin, and I know with absolute certainty that when it finally makes up its mind, there will be nothing I can do. I wake up gasping, my lungs burning like they're actually starved for oxygen, and the taste in my mouth is algae and rot. I started taking the long way to work, avoiding the turnoff to Cascade Lake Road. But the island is only so big. 57 square miles, most of it forest and rock and water. You can't really avoid anything on orcas for long. The island folds in on itself, trails loop back on each other, and the water is everywhere. In the bays and inlets and hidden ponds, seeping up through the soil, hanging in the air like a presence you can almost see. In November, I ran into the park ranger at the general store. We'd met before, exchanged the kind of casual conversation that substitutes for friendship in small communities. He was buying coffee, an industrial-strength rope, and I was pretending to need groceries I didn't want. He asked about my dog, how he was liking the trails, and I mentioned, trying to sound offhand, trying not to sound like someone who'd been thinking about this for 2 months straight, that we'd had a strange experience at Cascade Lake. The ranger's expression did something complicated. Not quite concern, not quite recognition, but something that lived in the space between. He said they'd been finding damage recently, kayaks mostly, some canoes. Long scratches in the fiberglass, deep enough to compromise the hull. The rental companies were furious. He mentioned otters, said they could get aggressive during mating season. Territorial. Said it like he was reading from a script he didn't quite believe. Then he paused, weighing something, and added that one of the scratches had gone clean through a 1/4-inch hull. Straight lines, 4 of them, parallel. He said it quietly, almost apologetically, like he was confessing to seeing something he shouldn't have. I asked what made marks like that. He didn't answer directly, just mentioned that the lake was deeper than the official surveys indicated. Said they'd sent down a drone 2 years ago for a geological study and lost the signal at 300 feet. The drone never came back up. Equipment malfunction, probably. These things happen. But he hadn't said otter. Not exactly. He danced around it, used phrases like wildlife activity and territorial behavior. But the word itself had stayed lodged in his throat, and standing there, in the harsh fluorescent light of the store, holding a basket I couldn't remember filling, I understood that he'd seen something too, or heard about something, or found something he couldn't explain and had been instructed not to alarm the tourists. The word he hadn't said followed me out of the store and into my truck and back to my empty house. Otters don't lurk. They don't float motionless and watch. They don't sink without air bubbles. They don't grow large enough to scratch through fiberglass like it's paper. They don't have eyes covered in gray film that pulses with its own heartbeat. December brought rain, the kind that doesn't stop, just changes intensity. The island turned sodden and primordial, and water ran down every hillside, pooled in every depression, filled the air with the sound of itself. My rental property flooded. Not badly, just enough to require constant bailing, and I found myself spending hours in the crawl space with a pump, listening to water drip through the foundation, wondering if it was just water or if something was moving in it. I started seeing the eyes everywhere, in the knots of trees, in the pattern of moss on rocks, in the dark spaces between waves when I drove past the shore. My rational mind knew this was pareidolia, the human brain's tendency to find faces in random patterns, a survival mechanism gone haywire. But knowing the name of something doesn't make it stop happening, doesn't make the crawling sensation on the back of your neck go away. My neighbor, a woman who'd lived on the island for 40 years, who knew the water like some people know their own heartbeat, stopped by one evening with a casserole I didn't want and concern I couldn't quite read. She asked if I was sleeping okay, said I looked thin, asked if I'd considered leaving the island for a while. Just a vacation, she said. Just to clear my head. The way she said it made me understand she was offering an exit strategy, a socially acceptable way to run. I asked her what she knew about Cascade Lake. Her face went carefully blank, that particular expression people get when they're deciding whether lying would be kinder than the truth. She told me that her grandmother used to say the old tribes wouldn't fish there, wouldn't even drink from the streams that fed it. They had a word for it, something that translated roughly to the lake that swallows. But that was just superstition, she added quickly. Old stories meant to keep children away from deep water. She left the casserole and a lingering look that felt like a warning. That night I dreamed I was back at the lake, but it wasn't September anymore. The water was black, the sky was black, and I was wading in up to my chest. My dog was on the shore, making that sound again, that questioning whimper growl that vibrated in the space behind my ribs. And something was rising beneath me. I could feel it, a pressure building from below, a displacement of water that meant something massive was pushing toward the surface. I tried to swim back, but my legs wouldn't work. I tried to scream, but my lungs were already full. And then I felt it, something brushing against my ankle, rough and cold and covered in growth, something that wrapped around my calf with the curious pressure of something that had never learned to be gentle. I woke up on the floor, my sheets tangled around me like I'd been fighting them, my ankle burning. In the weak dawn light filtering through my window, I could see marks. 4 parallel lines, raised and red, running from my calf to my heel. They looked like scratches. They looked like something had tested its grip and found me wanting. I went back to Cascade Lake on a Tuesday in late December, when the rain had finally stopped and the sky had cracked open into something pale and hostile. I told myself I was proving something, to whom I couldn't say. But the alternative was accepting that I was losing my mind, that stress and isolation had finally achieved what they'd been working toward, and that felt worse somehow than whatever was waiting at the lake. My dog refused to get in the truck. I left him home. The trail was empty, the beach deserted. Tourist season was over, and the locals knew better. The water was gray, choppy from a wind that hadn't been forecast, and the sound it made against the rocks was wrong. Too wet, too close to breathing. I stood at the exact spot where I'd stood in September, and I called out to it. Called to what, I didn't know. But I was tired of waiting, tired of looking over my shoulder, tired of that crawling certainty that something was watching me always, from every reflection, every shadow, every place where water touched the world. Nothing answered. Just wind, just waves, just the oppressive weight of the forest at my back and the deeper weight of the water ahead. I felt stupid and small and relieved, and I started to laugh at myself, at the absurdity of standing on a beach shouting at a lake because I'd convinced myself. The water went still, not gradually, instantly, mid-wave, mid-ripple. The entire surface of the lake froze into perfect smoothness. The wind kept blowing through the trees, kept pulling at my jacket, but the water didn't respond. It sat there like a mirror, like glass, like an eye that had finally decided to open all the way and look directly at what was screaming into it. And then I saw them. Not one set of eyes. Dozens. Hundreds. breaking the surface in a ring around the lake, every floating log and piece of debris suddenly rotating to face inward, toward me. Gray films pulsing over pupils I couldn't see, snouts covered in algae, bodies suspended beneath, massive and wrong and patient. They'd been there the whole time, every time, waiting in the water, watching from below, learning. And now they'd decided I'd seen enough. Now they'd decided it was time to show me what the lake had been swallowing all along. I don't remember running. I remember the trail, the truck, the engine that wouldn't start. That took 3 tries while I watched the rearview mirror and prayed nothing was coming up from the lake. Nothing was following. Nothing was scratching its way across the parking lot toward me. I'm writing this from a motel on the mainland. I left Orcas 3 days ago, packed what I could carry, abandoned the rest. My neighbor will think I'm on vacation. The ranger will think I couldn't handle the island winters. Let them think it. Let them find their own explanations. But I know I haven't left it behind. I can feel it still, that pressure beneath the surface, that certainty of being watched. When I shower, I keep my eyes closed. When it rains, I hear something else in the sound. And every body of water I pass, every lake, every river, every decorative fountain in every parking lot, seems deeper than it should be, darker than it has any right to be. My ankle still burns. The marks haven't faded. They've spread, actually, crawling up my calf in patient increments, like something is mapping me from a distance, like something is deciding. Last night I dreamed of drowning, but I was breathing. The water was full of eyes, and they were all the same eyes, and they were all looking at me with that gray-filmed patience of something that has waited centuries and can wait centuries more. I think it let me leave. I think it wanted me to, and I think it knows exactly where I am. The motel has a pool. It's closed for the season, covered with a tarp. But sometimes, late at night, I hear something moving in it. A displacement of water that shouldn't be there. A breathing that doesn't belong. I keep the curtains closed now. I don't look at puddles. I don't trust mirrors anymore. Not when they might show me something floating just behind my reflection. Something with narrow snout and patient eyes and a hunger that has nothing to do with flesh. They say otters are curious creatures. They say they're playful, intelligent, capable of remarkable problem solving. They don't say what happens when something that looks like an otter learns to want more than fish. They don't say what happens when it follows you home. Story 11. The ocean doesn't forget. That's what my grandmother used to say, back when I still visited the coast without feeling my chest tighten. She meant it poetically, I think. Something about tides carrying memories, about salt preserving secrets. I understand it differently now. Some things the ocean doesn't forget because it never stopped watching in the first place. It was late September when we drove up to the northwest coast, chasing the last warm days before the storms rolled in. My partner had been working 70-hour weeks at the hospital, her eyes perpetually red-rimmed, her hands shaking slightly whenever she tried to hold a coffee cup steady. We needed to get away, she'd said. Just drive, just breathe. I'd agreed without hesitation, throwing our bags into the trunk of my aging Subaru, heading north on Highway 101 until the trees grew dense and the fog rolled in like a living thing. We'd been driving for hours when hunger finally caught up with us. The roadside diners had all closed by then, their neon signs dark against the encroaching night. She suggested we stop somewhere along the coast, eat the sandwiches we'd packed that morning, watch the waves for a while. I took the next turn off, following a gravel road that wound through stands of Douglas fir and Sitka spruce, their branches forming a canopy so thick that my headlights seemed to die a few feet ahead of the hood. The beach appeared suddenly, the trees giving way to a wide expanse of sand and stone. No other cars, no houses visible through the darkness, just the endless percussion of waves against shore, a sound that should have been soothing but felt instead like a countdown. I killed the engine and the silence rushed in. Not real silence, never that near the ocean, but something close to it. The kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat. We ate in the car, windows cracked to let in the salt air, She talked about her patients, about the ones who made it and the ones who didn't, about the arbitrary nature of human fragility. I listened, offering the small sounds of acknowledgement that 8 years together had taught me were enough. The dashboard clock read 10:47 p.m. I remember that clearly because I'd been checking it, calculating how much farther we could drive before exhaustion forced us to find a motel. That's when the light appeared. It emerged from the water perhaps a quarter-mile offshore, a solid column of white that seemed to emanate from beneath the surface rather than above it. Not the sweeping arc of a lighthouse beam, but something rigid and purposeful, a finger of illumination that held its position against the darkness. I stopped mid-sentence, my sandwich forgotten. Beside me, I felt her go still. The beam began to move. It didn't sweep. That's the detail that would stay with me, that would wake me up months later with my heart hammering against my ribs. It didn't swing in an arc like every lighthouse, every searchlight, every reasonable source of illumination I'd ever encountered. It moved forward, traveling parallel to the water's surface, gliding across the waves in a perfectly straight line toward the shore. Toward us. The light was wrong somehow. Too white, too defined. Where it touched the water, it didn't reflect or scatter the way light should. It cut through the darkness like a blade through fabric, illuminating a narrow corridor of sea with surgical precision. I could see the waves within that beam, could count the whitecaps, but everything beyond its reach remained absolute black. My hand found the door handle. Some primitive part of my brain was screaming at me to run, to start the car, to put distance between us and that approaching column of light. But I couldn't move. I sat transfixed, watching the beam glide closer, feeling a cold weight settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature. She spoke then, her voice thin and strange. "What is that?" 3 words, barely a whisper. I didn't answer because I had no answer. The beam continued its inexorable advance, and I understood with sudden, terrible clarity that it was going to reach us. That it had always been going to reach us. That we'd stopped here, on this particular beach, at this particular hour, because something had wanted us to. The thought should have been absurd. It was absurd. But the certainty of it sank into my bones like winter cold. The beam touched the sand 30 yards ahead of us. For a moment it held its position, a column of light connecting sea to shore. Then it began moving again, crawling up the beach with that same unnatural precision, illuminating the dark sand, the scattered driftwood, the tidal debris that marked the high water line. Moving toward our car, I turned the key. The engine coughed, died, turned it again. Nothing. The battery indicator glowed on the dashboard. We had power, but something was preventing the starter from catching. My hands fumbled with the key, sweat making my fingers slip despite the October chill. 20 yards away now. I could hear something beneath the wave sound, a low-frequency hum that I felt more than heard, that seemed to vibrate through the car's frame and into my chest. The light was so bright now that I had to squint, but I couldn't look away. There was something in that beam, some quality that demanded attention, that pinned you in place like a moth on a collector's board. 15 yards. The engine caught. I slammed the transmission into reverse, stomped the accelerator hard enough that gravel sprayed against the undercarriage. The car lurched backward, tires spinning for purchase on the loose surface. In my peripheral vision, I saw the beam reach the spot where we'd been parked. Saw it hold there for perhaps 3 seconds, counting, measuring, confirming, before continuing its march up the beach toward the tree line. I didn't realize I'd been holding my breath until we hit the main road and the forest swallowed us again. My partner sat rigid in the passenger seat, hands pressed flat against her thighs. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have sounded insane. We drove for another hour before finding a motel with a vacancy sign, and even then, I parked under the brightest light in the lot, where we could see the car from our window. That night I lay awake listening to the sound of her breathing, trying to convince myself that what we'd seen had been a fishing boat, a Coast Guard vessel, something rational and explicable. But fishing boats didn't move like that. Coast Guard searchlights swept in arcs, searching for something lost. This had moved with purpose, with intention. like it knew exactly what it was looking for. The weeks that followed were worse than the night itself. At first, I tried to dismiss it, filing the experience away under strange but ultimately harmless. We'd seen something unusual, gotten spooked, driven away. That should have been the end of it. But the memory wouldn't fade the way memories are supposed to. If anything, it grew sharper, more defined, accruing details I couldn't remember noticing at the time. I started checking the news obsessively. Local papers, maritime reports, Coast Guard bulletins. Nothing. No mentions of unusual activity. No warnings about suspicious vessels. Just the ordinary traffic of a working waterfront. Fishing boats, cargo ships, the occasional pleasure craft. I told myself this was good news, evidence that we'd simply misinterpreted something mundane. But the absence of information felt more like a cover-up than a coincidence. She noticed, of course. Found me at 3 a.m, laptop glowing in the darkness, scrolling through pages of maritime incident reports. Her hand on my shoulder, gentle but firm. "You need to sleep," she said. "We're both fine. It's over." But her eyes said something different. Her eyes said she remembered that beam just as clearly as I did, that she too woke up sometimes reaching for the light switch, needing to confirm that the darkness was just darkness. Then the Coast Guard made their announcement. It was a brief statement, buried on page 7 of the regional paper. Unmarked vessels had been observed conducting rapid collection operations in several isolated coves along the northwest coast. The public was advised to report any suspicious maritime activity. No mention of what was being collected, no details about the vessels themselves. Just enough information to confirm that something had been happening in those waters and that the authorities knew about it. I should have felt relieved. There was an explanation, however vague. Drug runners, probably, or smugglers avoiding customs inspections. Criminal, certainly, but human. Understandable. The kind of danger that made sense in a world governed by rational laws. But relief wouldn't come, because the statement didn't explain the light. Smugglers used the darkness, moved unseen through the night. They didn't announce their presence with beams bright enough to be seen from shore. They didn't advance in straight lines toward random vehicles parked on empty beaches. And they definitely didn't make car engines fail. I hadn't told her about that detail. Hadn't wanted to admit how completely the fear had seized me in that moment. How certain I'd been that the car wouldn't start, that we'd be trapped there while the beam reached us and something emerged from that impossible light. The engine failure had to be coincidence, a momentary hiccup, a quirk of the aging starter motor. Except the car had run fine before that night and ran fine afterward. Except I'd turned the key 3 times with the battery showing full charge and gotten nothing. I started avoiding the coast. Found excuses to stay inland when she suggested day trips. The sight of the ocean filled me with a low-grade nausea that I couldn't explain and didn't want to examine. At night, I began checking the windows before bed, making sure the curtains were fully closed, that no gap existed through which light might enter. She asked once if I was feeling all right. I lied and said yes. What else could I say? That I was afraid of searchlights? That I'd started having dreams where the beam found me, pinned me, and something rose from the water with clicking, measuring sounds? The rational part of my mind insisted I was being ridiculous. We'd witnessed smugglers doing reconnaissance, nothing more. They'd spotted our car, wanted to make sure we weren't law enforcement, and moved on when we fled. The light was a powerful lamp. The hum was a boat engine. The engine failure was automotive. Everything had an explanation. But late at night, when sleep wouldn't come and the darkness pressed against the windows, I remembered the way that beam had moved, the absolute precision of its path, the way it had seemed to know exactly where we were, exactly where we would be. And I remembered something else, something I'd buried, refused to acknowledge even to myself. For just a moment, just before I'd gotten the car started, I'd seen something in that beam. Not in the light itself, but in the darkness it carved from the surrounding night. A shape, perhaps. Or shapes. Multiple presences moving within the column of illumination, keeping pace with its advance, neither quite solid nor quite transparent. I told myself it was an optical illusion. shadows playing tricks. The mind constructing patterns from random visual noise, because that's what minds do when confronted with the inexplicable. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been looking back at me through that light, that whatever had been out there hadn't been searching at all. It had been pointing. 6 months later, I found myself back on Highway 101, alone this time. She was at a conference in Portland, wouldn't be back until Sunday. I'd told myself I was just going for a drive, getting some air, taking advantage of an unexpectedly clear February day. But I knew where I was going. I'd known since I got in the car. The turnoff looked different in daylight. Smaller. The gravel road that had seemed so ominous in the darkness was just a narrow track through the trees, probably used by fishermen and locals who knew the hidden beaches. I followed it down to the shore, parked in almost the exact spot where we'd stopped 6 months earlier. The beach was empty. Gray sky, gray water, gray sand. The kind of colorless coastal day that makes you understand why people who live here have such specific words for different types of rain. I got out of the car, walked down to where the tide line met the beach. Looking for what? Evidence? Closure? Some sign that what I'd seen had been real or hadn't been real? I found nothing. Just kelp and driftwood and the eternal sound of waves. No mysterious lights, no humming frequencies, no shapes in the darkness because there was no darkness. Just the pale wash of afternoon light that made everything look exposed and ordinary. I should have felt better. Should have laughed at myself for being so spooked by what was obviously just a weird encounter with some criminals doing criminal things. But standing there on that beach, I felt the weight of the ocean behind me like a physical presence. Felt watched, observed, measured. The beam had come from the water. That much I knew with absolute certainty. But standing there in the daylight, looking out at the endless Pacific, I realized how impossible that was. The water where the beam had originated was deep, at least 50 feet, maybe more. No boat that size could get that close to shore without running aground. No submarine could operate in those depths. No diving light could punch through that much water and still emerge as a solid column of illumination. Unless it hadn't come from a boat at all. The thought arrived fully formed, undeniable. I rejected it immediately, violently, the way you reject any idea that threatens the foundations of your understanding. But it stayed there, coiled in the back of my mind, like something waiting. Patient. Certain. I walked back to my car, started it without incident, drove away from that beach and promised myself I wouldn't return. That promise has held. Mostly. But sometimes, driving home late at night, I see lighthouses in the distance. I watch their beams sweep across the darkness in regular, predictable arcs, searching, always searching. And I remember the light that didn't search at all, the light that moved in a straight line, the light that knew. The Coast Guard never made another announcement about the unmarked vessels. I've checked. Whatever was being collected in those coves, whatever operation was underway, it ended or moved, or simply stopped being acknowledged. The official silence is absolute, complete, as if nothing ever happened. My partner doesn't talk about that night anymore. We've reached an unspoken agreement that some experiences are better left unexamined, some questions better left unasked. But I've seen her pause when we pass beachfront property, her eyes scanning the water with an expression I recognize because I see it in my own face when I catch my reflection unexpectedly. We're both waiting for something. I just don't know what. The ocean doesn't forget. My grandmother was right about that, even if she didn't know why. It doesn't forget because it's still watching, still measuring, still pointing at things the rest of us are meant to see. Or perhaps, and this is the thought that keeps me awake some nights, the one I can never quite banish no matter how hard I try. We're the ones being shown, identified, marked with that absolute white light for some purpose we're not meant to understand. I still see beams of light sometimes, in that space between waking and sleep. They move across the ceiling of our bedroom with mechanical precision, never sweeping, never searching, just advancing in straight lines toward a destination they've already chosen. And I wonder if the light will come back, if it ever really left. If somewhere out there in the dark waters of the Pacific Northwest, something is still conducting its rapid collections, still pointing its impossible beam at empty beaches, where ordinary people stop to eat sandwiches and watch the waves, I wonder if we were meant to drive away that night, or if driving away was always part of the procedure, part of the collection. The worst part is not knowing, not the fear itself, but the uncertainty, the terrible ambiguity between rational explanation and impossible truth, between what I know to be possible and what I saw with my own eyes. Sometimes I think the Coast Guard knew exactly what was out there, that their vague announcement was a warning disguised as information. Stay away from the beaches. Don't stop on empty roads after dark. If you see lights where lights shouldn't be, don't wait to understand them. Just run. Other times I think I imagined the whole thing. That stress and darkness and a too active imagination conspire to transform a fishing boat into something inexplicable. That the human mind is so desperate for meaning that it will construct entire mythologies from nothing more than fear and coincidence. But then I remember the sound, the low-frequency hum that shook the car's frame, the way it felt inside my chest like a second heartbeat, the way my partner looked in the light, her face drained of color, her eyes reflecting something that couldn't be captured in words. I remember the shapes I saw, or didn't see, moving within the beam, the absolute certainty that something was aware of us, something that had chosen that moment, that beach, that precise location to reveal itself, or to test us, or to mark us for reasons beyond human understanding. The ocean doesn't forget. And neither, I think, does whatever lives beneath it, whatever pointed at us that night with its rigid, unblinking eye of light. It knows we were there. It knows we saw. It knows where we went and where we live and how to find us again if it wants to. That's the thought I can't escape. That's the fear that has burrowed into my mind and made a home there, patient and permanent. Not that something strange happened once on a dark beach, but that it wasn't an ending at all. It was an introduction. And somewhere out there, in water so deep that light from the surface never reaches bottom, something is still conducting its operations, still collecting, still pointing, still waiting to see if we'll come back. Story 12. The cabin appeared exactly as the listing promised. Weathered cedar siding, a stone chimney listing slightly to the left, and the Deschutes River murmuring 50 yards from the sagging porch. What the listing hadn't mentioned was the silence, not peaceful, but absolute, as if the forest had inhaled and forgotten to breathe out again. My colleague and I had driven 6 hours from Portland to escape the conference chaos, seeking what he called authentic solitude for our research notes. He'd fallen asleep within minutes of arriving, his sleeping bag a dark chrysalis in the corner farthest from the windows. I'd volunteered for the first shift of wakefulness, though I couldn't have explained what we were taking shifts against. The tapping started at 11:47 p.m. At first I mistook it for a branch, despite the windless night. A single knock against the northern window, deliberate as a knuckle on wood. I glanced up from my laptop, its glow the only light source I'd allowed myself, and saw nothing beyond the glass but my own reflection fractured against darkness. 30 seconds later, another tap. Eastern window this time, then the southern one. The pattern emerged slowly, each knock separated by intervals just long enough to make me question the previous one. By midnight, I'd mapped it mentally, a clockwise progression around the cabin's perimeter, each window receiving attention before the sequence moved on. What disturbed me wasn't the tapping itself, but its precision, each knock at identical height, as if measured against an invisible ruler. My colleague's breathing remained steady, untouched by dreams or the sounds that were surely loud enough to wake anyone whose sleep wasn't suspiciously deep. I thought about waking him, felt my hand halfway to his shoulder before I stopped. The tapping had changed. Now it came from multiple directions simultaneously, no longer sequential but choreographed, as if whatever circled the cabin had learned to be in several places at once. When I finally stood and approached the eastern window, My reflection slid across the glass like oil on water. The laptop's glow behind me cast my shadow forward, and for a moment I couldn't distinguish my silhouette from the shapes beyond the window. Then I saw her. She stood perhaps 10 feet from the cabin, though the darkness made distance unreliable. Her dress, once white, now the color of river clay, hung heavy with moisture, clinging to her frame in ways that suggested she'd been wearing it for longer than the single night we'd occupied this space. But it was her face that locked my hand on the window frame, fingernails biting into old wood. She was smiling. Not the social smile of strangers meeting, not even the nervous grin of someone lost and seeking help. This was something else entirely. A smile so wide it seemed to creak at the corners, held so perfectly still it looked painted on. Her eyes reflected the laptop's glow in pinpoints, twin stars in a face otherwise smooth and featureless as a river stone. My hand moved to the latch before conscious thought caught up. Some buried instinct, maybe, the same one that makes you open the door when someone knocks, that convinces you hospitality matters, even when your hindbrain is screaming warnings in a language older than words. The latch clicked. The window swung inward on hinges that hadn't been oiled in decades. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of wet earth and something underneath it. Something that reminded me of the time I'd found a deer carcass in my childhood woods. Not the smell of death itself, but the sweet, sick odor of earth disturbed by decay, the perfume of things returning to soil. She hadn't moved. The smile remained, unblinking, and I realized with a shock that sent ice down my spine that I couldn't see her chest moving. No breath misted in the October air between us. I slammed the window shut with enough force to crack the frame. The old wood splintered slightly and I threw the latch with shaking hands, then dragged the filing cabinet we'd brought for the trip in front of it. The metal scraped across floorboards loud enough to wake anyone, but my colleague remained motionless in his sleeping bag, face turned toward the wall. For the next hour, I sat with my back against the barricaded window, listening. The tapping continued, but now I could feel it through the walls. A vibration more than a sound, as if the cabin itself had developed a pulse. I tracked each knock obsessively, trying to map a pattern, trying to find logic in the sequence. Northeast corner, then southern wall midpoint, then the door frame, then back to the eastern window I'd blocked. She was mapping the cabin, learning it, testing it. At some point, exhaustion must have claimed me, because I woke to gray dawn light filtering through unwashed windows and my colleague standing at the door, examining the frame with the focused attention he usually reserved for his research. He commented that I looked like hell, suggested I'd been working too late again, reminded me that proper sleep hygiene was essential for cognitive function. He said nothing about the noises, gave no indication he'd heard anything unusual. When I mentioned the tapping, the woman, his expression shifted into something between concern and condescension, the look medical professionals reserve for patients who might need psychiatric evaluation. Maybe I'd dreamed it. Maybe the 6-hour drive, the unfamiliar space, the absolute darkness of rural Oregon had conspired to unhinge something in my perception. I wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe it so badly I almost convinced myself, until we stepped outside and I saw the footprints. They circled the cabin in a perfect figure 8, one loop smaller than the other, intersecting at the front door. But these weren't normal footprints. Each one was filled with dark, viscous liquid that hadn't quite dried despite the hours since dawn. Blood, unmistakably, though whether it was fresh or old I couldn't determine. The prints themselves were narrow, definitely feminine, and completely barefoot despite the October cold. The pattern was mathematical in its precision, each step exactly 18 inches from the next, the curves of the 8 so perfect they could have been drawn with a compass. I knelt beside one print, my fingers hovering above the pooled liquid but not quite touching, and noticed the deep gashes, 5 parallel lines on each print where toes would have gripped earth. The glass-like quality of the ground suggested she'd walked here repeatedly, wearing down stone and soil into grooves. My colleague studied the pattern with academic detachment, then suggested wildlife, a bear, maybe, or a mountain lion following some instinctual patrol route. When I pointed out the distinctly human shape, the obvious heel and arch structure, he shrugged and mentioned pareidolia. our tendency to see human patterns in random stimuli. The neighbor arrived while we were still outside, his truck rattling down the access road with the particular confidence of someone who knows every rut and stone. He was older than I'd expected, weathered in the way of people who've spent their entire lives in one place, roots growing deeper than mobile blood allows. He introduced himself as the property manager, here to check we'd settled in properly, make sure the propane was working, all the standard landlord protocols. His eyes caught on the footprints. Something flickered across his face. Not surprise, but resignation. The expression of someone who's had this conversation before. He told us to keep the door locked. No elaboration, no explanation, just those 7 words delivered with the weight of gospel truth. When I pressed for details, who was she? What did she want? Why did her footsteps form this specific pattern? He simply repeated the instruction. If we kept the door locked, she'd get tired eventually. They always did. The word always hung in the air like smoke. I asked how many others had stayed here, how many had seen her. He suggested we enjoy our stay, mentioned the excellent hiking trails along the river, and drove away before we could ask anything else. That night, I reinforced every entry point. The door received not just its standard lock, but also a chair wedged under the knob, the 2x4 I'd found in the shed jammed between handle and frame. I blocked the eastern window more thoroughly, stacking our equipment cases in front of it. I even nailed boards across the smaller windows in the bathroom and kitchen, using whatever materials I could scavenge. My colleague watched with poorly concealed alarm, asking if I was feeling okay, suggesting maybe we should head back to Portland early. I insisted we'd paid for 3 nights, we had work to complete, and I'd feel better once we were secure. The word secure tasted wrong in my mouth, too optimistic for what I actually felt. The tapping started earlier this time, 9:23 p.m., while there was still a ghost of twilight outside. But now it came with something else, a voice. Not quite singing, not quite speaking, but something between, a rhythmic vocalization that might have been words in a language I didn't recognize, or might have been the sound the wind makes when it has nowhere to go. It circled the cabin just like the footsteps, and I realized with horror that I could track her progress not just by sound, but by the way the temperature dropped as she passed each section of wall. She was colder than the October night. Somehow, impossibly, her presence sucked heat from the air itself. I sat in the center of the room, equidistant from all walls, my laptop abandoned. My colleague had retreated to his sleeping bag again, though I couldn't tell if he was actually asleep or just pretending, hiding from something he couldn't admit was happening. The voice grew louder, and with it came the smell. Stronger now. That wet earth and corruption scent flooding through gaps I couldn't identify, seeping through walls that should have been solid. I found myself breathing through my mouth, trying not to gag, trying not to acknowledge what my hindbrain already knew. She was decomposing. Whatever stood outside wasn't quite alive, but wasn't quite dead enough to stop moving. At 11:47 p.m. exactly, the same time the tapping had started the previous night, everything stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. In the void left by her absence, I became hyper-aware of every sound the cabin made. The settling of old wood, the tick of cooling propane lines, the whisper of my own breathing. I waited for my colleague to wake, to acknowledge what we'd both heard, but he remained motionless. I stayed awake until dawn, watching the door, listening for footsteps I knew I wouldn't hear until she was ready to be heard. The pattern in the dirt had changed. Where yesterday's figure 8 had been neat and precise, today's was larger, the loops expanding to encompass not just the cabin but the first line of trees. The blood in each footprint looked darker, thicker, and as I traced the path with my eyes, I realized she'd added something new. At the intersection point where the 2 loops met, she'd drawn something in the dirt, not with her feet, but with her fingers. Long grooves in the earth forming symbols I didn't recognize, but which nonetheless triggered something primal in my pattern recognition centers. They meant something. They were telling me something. I just couldn't understand the language. My colleague emerged, looked at my face, and suggested we leave. He said it simply, without explanation, as if he'd reached some internal conclusion he couldn't articulate. For a moment, I felt relief flooding through me. Finally, acknowledgement. Finally, someone else seeing what I saw. But then he mentioned my stress levels, the importance of self-care, how isolation could trigger psychological episodes in even the most stable individuals. He wasn't suggesting we leave because something was wrong with this place. He was suggesting we leave because something was wrong with me. I wanted to argue. I wanted to grab him by the shoulders and drag him to the symbols in the dirt, force him to see the mathematical impossibility of their precision, the deliberate intelligence behind their formation. Instead, I heard myself agreeing, saying we'd pack up in the morning, head back after one more night. One more night. The words felt like a prison sentence. I spent that day researching. My laptop, bless its modern connectivity, managed to catch a weak signal from somewhere, enough to load pages if I was patient. I searched for the cabin's history, for reports of missing persons, for folklore about women in wet dresses and figures that walked in eights. What I found was worse than nothing. Not a single result. No historical record, no local legends, no news articles about strange occurrences. Either this was so isolated that nothing had ever been documented, or someone had been very thorough about erasing what had. The sun set at 6:34 p.m. I watched it go with the feeling of a condemned prisoner watching their final sunset. My colleague suggested we drive into town for dinner, get away from the cabin for a few hours, but I couldn't make myself leave. Some instinct insisted that abandoning our shelter, even temporarily, would be catastrophic, that she'd know, that she'd be inside when we returned. So we ate our canned soup and stale bread in silence, the propane camp stove hissing in the growing dark, and we waited. She came at 9:23 p.m. again, right on schedule. But tonight, the tapping was different. Instead of the exploratory knocks of the first night, these were demands. Hard enough to rattle the windows in their frames, hard enough to make the door shudder against its barricade. The voice came with them, louder now, and I could almost understand it. Words just at the edge of comprehension, like trying to remember a song you heard in childhood. My colleague was awake, sitting bolt upright in his sleeping bag, and the look on his face told me everything. He heard it. He'd always heard it. He'd just been trying desperately not to. We didn't speak. What was there to say? That we were trapped in a deteriorating cabin while something that shouldn't exist circled it with mathematical precision. That her footsteps were growing louder, closer, as if the walls themselves were thinning. At midnight, I made the mistake of looking out the western window, the one I hadn't yet fully blocked. She was closer than before, close enough that I could see her face clearly in the ambient light from my laptop. The smile was still there, but now I could see it was wrong in ways I hadn't noticed before. Her lips didn't quite meet at the corners. Her teeth were too white, too uniform, like dentures carved from soap. And her eyes, those pinpoint reflections I'd seen before, weren't catching light at all. They were generating it, glowing with a pale luminescence that reminded me of bioluminescent fungi, of things that live in caves and ocean trenches where sunlight never reaches. She raised her hand to the glass. Her fingers were too long, the joints bending in one place too many, and as she dragged them across the window, they left trails, not of dirt or condensation, but of something that looked like liquid darkness, thick as paint, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. The glass began to fog from her side, frost spreading in patterns that weren't random at all but formed the same symbols she'd drawn in the dirt, mathematical, precise, meaningful in ways my conscious mind couldn't grasp, but which my lizard brain recognized as profoundly, fundamentally wrong. I backed away from the window, bumping into my colleague, both of us pressed together in the center of the room like children during a thunderstorm. The cabin had become a cage, its walls closing in not physically but psychologically, every exit point a potential entry for something that defied the rules I'd built my understanding of reality upon. The tapping grew faster, more insistent, coming from all sides now in a rhythm that might have been a heartbeat if heartbeats could be fractal and recursive. And underneath it, a new sound, scratching. Not the casual scratch of branches on siding, but deliberate, purposeful, the sound of nails or claws working at the gaps between boards, testing for weakness, searching for entry. My colleague whispered that we should call someone. Police, maybe, or the property manager, anyone. But my phone showed no signal, and his was the same. The weak connection I'd found earlier now completely absent. We were isolated not just physically, but technologically, cut off from the modern world that insisted such things couldn't happen. At 2 a.m. the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was worse because it felt anticipatory, a held breath before the scream. I stared at the door, at the chair wedged under the knob, at the 2x4 that suddenly seemed laughably inadequate, and I wondered what we'd do if she simply decided to come in. If she'd been testing us this whole time, learning our defenses, waiting for the moment when exhaustion made us careless. The knock, when it came, was soft, almost gentle. A polite tap, tap, tap on the door frame, the kind of knock a friend might make when they don't want to startle you. My colleague took a step toward it before I grabbed his arm. He looked at me with eyes that didn't quite focus, and I recognized the expression, the glazed look of someone being called, pulled by something deeper than conscious thought. I held him back, wrestling his arm, both of us swaying in the dark cabin like clumsy dancers. Then her voice came through the door, clear as crystal, speaking English for the first time. A question, simple and direct, asking if we needed help, if we were okay, mentioning she'd seen our lights and wondered if we were lost. It sounded so reasonable, so normal, so human. My colleague pulled harder against my grip, insisting we should let her in. She was just trying to help. What kind of people were we to leave someone outside in the cold? And for a moment, just a moment, I almost believed it. Almost convinced myself I'd imagined everything. That exhaustion and isolation had painted something innocent with horror's brush. Then I smelled it through the door. That wet earth smell, stronger now, mixed with something new. Formaldehyde, maybe, or something like it. The chemical smell of preservation, of things kept too long past their expiration. I held my colleague tighter and said nothing, and after an eternity that might have been seconds or minutes or hours, I heard her footsteps moving away from the door, back into her pattern, back into her figure 8, those loops that were growing larger each night, as if she was spiraling inward, tightening around us like a noose. Dawn came eventually because dawn always does, indifferent to the terrors of night. The footprints in the dirt had multiplied, not just one path now, but dozens, overlapping 8s forming a complex pattern that looked almost like lace, or a mandala, or a map, to somewhere I never wanted to go. My colleague packed his things without speaking, moving with the efficiency of someone who's made a decision and refuses to reconsider. He suggested I should come with him, get some rest, maybe talk to someone professional about the stress I'd been under. When I refused, something like pity crossed his face, and I realized he'd rewritten the night in his mind already, convinced himself I'd had some kind of episode, that he'd stayed to make sure I didn't hurt myself. He drove away at 7 a.m., leaving me alone in the cabin with one night left on our reservation and a question I couldn't answer. Would she keep coming if there was only one of us? Was I the one she wanted? Or had my colleague's presence been essential somehow, a witness to make it real? I spent that day reinforcing barriers that already seemed inadequate, my hands moving automatically while my mind wandered territories I'd never mapped before. Maybe she'd always been here, a constant presence that needed specific conditions to manifest. The right number of occupants, the right time of year, the right pattern of skepticism and belief. Maybe she was the cabin itself, or something that lived in the space between belief and dismissal, growing stronger when acknowledged and starving when ignored. Or maybe I was losing my mind, and she'd never existed at all. Night fell. I waited. She came at 9:23 p.m., but this time I was at the eastern window before the first tap sounded. I'd removed my barricades deliberately, stripped away my defenses, and when she appeared in the darkness beyond the glass, I was already opening the latch. She stood there in her mud-soaked dress, smile wide and unwavering, and I understood finally that this had always been inevitable. Not an assault, not an invasion, but a patient waiting for permission. She couldn't enter unless invited, couldn't cross the threshold unless I opened it, and all her circling had been a kind of asking, a wordless request in a language older than speech. I didn't let her in. I also didn't close the window. We stared at each other across that liminal space, her in the October darkness and me in my lit rectangle of false safety, and I asked her what she wanted. Not out loud. I knew somehow that speech would break whatever fragile understanding we'd reached, but in the silence between heartbeats, in the space where fear and fascination intersect, she raised her too long hand and placed it against the window glass. Her palm left a print in that light-absorbing substance she secreted or produced or was made of, and in that print I saw patterns resolving, the symbols from the dirt clarifying into something approaching meaning. She wasn't asking to come in. She was asking me to come out, to join the pattern, to walk the figure eight until I wore it deeper into the earth, until the loops expanded to encompass the entire forest, the valley, the world, to become part of something vast and mathematical, and utterly inhuman, that nonetheless needed human components to function, like gears needing teeth or circuits needing current. I stood at that threshold, window open to October cold, and felt the pull of it. Not supernatural compulsion, but genuine temptation. What would it be like to stop questioning, to surrender to a pattern larger than myself, to walk in her footsteps until I wore away entirely into something else? I don't remember closing the window. I don't remember barricading it again, or wedging myself into the corner farthest from all entry points, or the remaining hours until dawn. My next clear memory is sunlight on my face and the property manager knocking on the door, asking if I was checking out today. I gathered my things mechanically, loaded them into my car, started the engine. The manager mentioned that the cabin was booked solid through next month, asked if I'd enjoyed my stay, if I'd recommend it to colleagues. I heard myself saying yes. It had been restful, exactly what I'd needed. As I drove down the access road, I looked in my rearview mirror. The cabin sat peaceful in morning light, smoke from its chimney rising straight into clear sky. And in the dirt around it, barely visible from this distance, the figure eight pattern stretched and spiraled, loops within loops, a fractal design that might have been growing or might have always been there, waiting for someone to notice. My phone found signal 10 miles down the road, messages from my colleague checking if I'd made it out safely, suggesting again that I should talk to someone. I started to reply, then stopped, my fingers hovering over the screen. Because in the corner of the window, faint but unmistakable, was a handprint. Too long, wrong number of joints, coated in something that didn't quite reflect the morning light, and in the settling dust on my dashboard, barely visible, someone had drawn a symbol, one of hers, one of the signs she'd traced in the dirt. I'd seen it form in the frost on the cabin window, in the pattern of her footsteps, in the space between sleeping and waking. I understood it now, the language finally clicking into place with the horrible clarity of revelation. It wasn't a symbol at all. It was a number. I erased it with my palm, leaving a smear that could have been dust or could have been something else. And I drove toward Portland with my radio off and my windows down, letting the wind howl through the car, loud enough to drown out the sound that I definitely wasn't hearing. The soft tap, tap, tap of someone keeping time, counting down from infinity, patient as stone, persistent as water wearing away rock. The cabin is still there, booked solid according to the listing I checked last week. The reviews mention its authentic rusticity, its peaceful isolation, the way the river sounds just like civilization falling away. No one mentions the woman. No one mentions the pattern. But sometimes when I'm falling asleep in my climate-controlled apartment 200 miles away, I hear her footsteps. Not outside my window. I'm on the 14th floor, nowhere for her to stand. But underneath everything, like a rhythm below the rhythm, mathematics underlying reality. And I know, with the certainty of someone who looked into eyes that generate their own light, that she's still walking, still tracing that figure eight into dirt and darkness, and the spaces between numbers, the loops expanding incrementally, patient as geology, until they reach me. Not tonight, not tomorrow, but eventually. She always gets tired, the property manager said. He never said when. Story 13. The bundle appeared on the third morning. I woke to a pressure against my bladder and the gray-blue light that comes just before dawn. The tent fabric rippled with condensation, and somewhere in the canopy above, a bird made a sound like branches scraping metal. I unzipped the inner mesh and froze. Leaning against the rainfly, perfectly aligned with the entrance, stood a construction of twisted branches, maybe 8 inches tall, bound at irregular intervals with what looked like fresh vine. Clusters of waxy yellow berries nested in the gaps between the wood, their surfaces reflecting the dim light like dozens of tiny eyes. The whole thing tilted slightly forward, as if bowing. I didn't touch it at first, just stared at the way the cordage wound around the branches in a pattern that seemed too deliberate to be random, too specific to be accidental. The berries gave off a faint sweetness that mixed with something else. A cold, ashy smell that reminded me of the morning after a campfire, when the stones still hold the memory of heat, but the embers have long since died. My hiking pole rested against the tent's corner. I used its rubber tip to knock the bundle sideways, watching it tumble into the leaf litter. The berries scattered. One rolled against my boot, and I stepped back without meaning to, nearly tripping over the tent's guy line. The thing about hiking alone is that every sound becomes a question mark. I'd chosen the Linville Gorge specifically for its reputation. Remote, challenging, the kind of place where you could spend 3 days without seeing another soul. The kind of place where silence pressed against your eardrums until you heard things that might not be there. I told myself it was wind, branches falling in a pattern that coincidentally looked arranged. Nature's sense of humor, but the cordage was too green, too supple. And as I packed my gear with hands that trembled just slightly, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder every few seconds, scanning the rhododendron thickets that surrounded the clearing. The forest watched back with 1,000 hidden angles. The trail down to Babel Tower should have taken 4 hours. I made it in 3, moving faster than I'd planned, my pack's hip belt cutting into my sides with each hurried step. The path narrowed where it cut along the gorge wall, and twice I had to stop and force myself to slow down. Not because of exhaustion, but because rushing on a cliff edge would accomplish nothing except a very permanent solution to temporary paranoia. By the time I reached the boulder field near the river, my legs shook with something that wasn't entirely physical exertion. The water noise helped. White noise, my therapist used to call it before I stopped going. Nature's static, drowning out the frequency where anxiety lives. I found a flat rock near the water and pulled out my phone, even though I'd turned it off to preserve battery. 1 bar of signal flickered in and out like a dying pulse. The screen showed 3 text messages from my brother, all asking if I was still alive, each one progressively more annoyed at my lack of response. The last one was from 2 days ago. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. What would I say? Found a creepy stick arrangement, freaking out like a child? I pocketed the phone. That's when I saw the second one. Across the river, maybe 30 yards upstream, another bundle leaned against a boulder. Same construction, branches, berries, green cordage. The angle was wrong for me to see it clearly, but the silhouette matched perfectly. The water between us moved fast, swollen with recent rain. No easy crossing point. I stood there for what might have been minutes or hours, watching that bundle, waiting for it to move or vanish or reveal itself as a natural formation that my brain had twisted into significance. It didn't move. It just waited. The trail journal at the Babel Tower shelter was a weathered notebook kept in a plastic bag, its pages swollen with moisture and cramped with entries from dozens of hikers. Most were mundane: trail conditions, weather reports, complaints about blisters. But 3 pages in, written in a tight, controlled hand, found markers again, 3rd time in 4 trips. Always the same configuration, 8 or 9 branches, yellow berries, pokeweed, green vine. They show up near my camp at night. Never during the day, never when I'm awake. If you see one, don't move your tent to a new spot. They're marking something, and they know you moved. They know. The entry was dated 6 months ago. Below it, in different handwriting, previous writer is paranoid. Saw one of these markers near Shortoff. Just sticks. Relax. And below that, in the same tight hand as the first entry, 3 people have gone missing from this trail system in the last 18 months. Check the ranger reports. They never mention the markers. Ask yourself why. I photographed the pages with shaking hands, the flash turning the words into white-burned ghosts on my screen. The shelter was empty. I'd have it to myself for the night, or so I'd thought. But as I set up my sleeping bag on the wooden platform, I found myself studying the forest line. The way the shadows between trees seemed deeper than they should be, even in daylight. The berries in the markers were pokeweed. I was almost certain now. Toxic if eaten, traditional in some folk practices for marking boundaries, for warning, for claiming. The word that kept circling my thoughts was they. I didn't use the shelter. Instead, I set up my tent 50 yards away, off trail, in a depression between 2 rocks where the ground was lumpy but concealed. I tied the small brass bells to fishing line and strung them around the perimeter, a trick I'd read about once for bear awareness. The bells were small enough that wind wouldn't move them, but anything larger than a squirrel would trigger the sound. Then I sat in my tent with my headlamp off and my knife in my hand, listening to nothing. The gorge at night generates its own acoustics. Wind moves through the canyon in waves, creating harmonics that sound almost like voices. Low murmurs that rise and fall without forming words. Owls call in frequencies that make your chest cavity resonate. Branches crack under the weight of cooling air or nocturnal animals or nothing at all. I counted my breaths. I focused on the sound of my sleeping bag's fabric against my legs. I tried not to think about the trail journal or the bundles or the way the cordage had been too perfect, too fresh. At 11:47 p.m., according to my watch's glowing dial, the bells rang. Not all of them. Just 2, on the northern side of my perimeter. A brief tink-tink, then silence. I stopped breathing. My hand tightened on the knife handle until my knuckles ached. Nothing. No footsteps. No follow-up sounds. Just the return of wind and distant water and the pressure of darkness against the tent's thin walls. I waited. Minutes became hours. My legs cramped. My back spasmed. I didn't move. At 2:13 a.m., the bells on the east side rang. 3 notes, almost melodic. At 3:40 a.m., the western bells. Twice. At 4:55 a.m., just before dawn, every bell rang at once. A sudden cascade of sound that lasted perhaps 3 seconds, and then stopped as if someone had grabbed all the lines simultaneously. I was out of the tent before conscious thought caught up with action, my headlamp blazing, knife extended, the beam swept across rhododendron leaves, tree trunks, empty spaces between shadows. The fishing line hung intact, bells still attached, swaying gently in the absence of wind. The ground around my tent showed no footprints, no disturbed leaves, no sign that anything had been there at all. But 20 feet away, carefully arranged on a flat stone, I counted 7 bundles. Not 1, 7. Each identical to the others, each pointing toward my tent like accusing fingers. I didn't stop to pack carefully. I stuffed everything into my bag with the methodical panic of someone who knows that haste kills on mountain trails, but can't quite convince his hands to slow down. The bundles sat there, waiting, their berry clusters catching the new light. The hike out should have taken me back through Babel Tower, but instead I took the Linville Gorge spur, longer, steeper, but it would get me to the parking area without backtracking, without passing through the places where I'd found the markers. 3 hours in, I realized I'd been hearing footsteps for the last 30 minutes. Not close. Maybe 50, 60 feet behind me. A rhythm that matched my own pace, but not quite. Always slightly offset. A syncopation that kept appearing in my peripheral hearing. When I stopped, they stopped. When I started again, after a delay that felt like consideration, they resumed. I told myself it was echo. The gorge walls playing tricks. My own footfalls bouncing back from stone surfaces and arriving on a delay. But echo doesn't explain why the footsteps continued when I stood still. Didn't explain the brief 3 or 4 steps that occurred after I'd frozen in place, as if whoever followed needed a moment to realize I'd stopped. The trail opened onto a ridge where I could see for half a mile in both directions. I turned and looked back. Empty. Nothing but the green tunnel of the trail winding down into the gorge. vegetation swallowing the path 20 yards behind me. I kept walking. The footsteps resumed. The parking lot appeared around noon, a miracle of flat asphalt and normal human geometry after 3 days of twisted rock and vertical forest. My truck sat exactly where I'd left it, already gathering pollen on the windshield. 2 other vehicles occupied spaces nearby, a Subaru with North Carolina plates, and a white van with tinted windows and no identifying marks. I loaded my pack into the truck bed, fingers fumbling with the tailgate latch. The keys felt strange in my hand, too light, like props in a play about normal life. Before I could open the driver's door, someone spoke behind me. "You see them too?" I spun. A man stood near the trailhead sign, maybe 60 years old, wearing clothes that had once been hiking gear but now looked more like permanent residence. Faded, patched, stained with the kind of wear that speaks to months rather than days. His face was weathered into deep creases, his eyes carrying a brightness that might have been intensity or instability or both. "The markers," he continued, taking a step closer. Not threatening, but purposeful. "The bundles. You saw them." My throat was dry. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do. That's why you came out early. That's why you're shaking." He pulled something from his pocket, a small cloth bag that clinked softly with metal. "Bells?" I didn't answer. "Smart. Smarter than most, but it doesn't matter. Once they mark you, they know. Moving doesn't help. Different trails don't help. I've tried." He gestured vaguely toward the gorge. "Been trying for 3 years." "Who's they?" His smile revealed teeth that needed a dentist's attention. "Does it matter? Give them a name and you make them smaller. Leave them unnamed and maybe you stay scared enough to stay safe." "There's nothing out there," I said, but the words felt thin even as they left my mouth. "It's just patterns, coincidence, paranoia." "Is it?" He took another step. Close enough now that I could smell him. Wood smoke and unwashed fabric and something medicinal. "Tell me something. When you heard the footsteps following you, did they sound like boots or something else? Something that only resembles walking when it remembers to try?" My hand was on the truck door. "I need to leave." "Of course you do. Everyone does. But here's what you'll find. 3 days from now, maybe 4, you'll be home. Safe, normal, and then you'll see one. On your porch maybe, or through your bedroom window, leaning against your car in the morning. Always the same configuration, always pointing at you." "You're insane," I said, but my voice cracked on the last word. "Probably," he agreed cheerfully. "The question is whether insanity is a symptom or an adaptation. Either way, welcome to the club." He held up the cloth bag, bells chiming. "You'll want more of these. They don't stop them, but they give you warning. Sometimes that's enough." I got in the truck and locked the doors. He stood in my rearview mirror as I pulled away, hand still raised, growing smaller and smaller until the trees swallowed him up. It's been 6 days since I left the gorge. The thing appeared on my apartment balcony 3 nights ago. Same construction, same berries, same green cordage that seems too fresh, too alive. I threw it away. It came back the next morning. I don't sleep well now. I keep the bells strung across my bedroom doorway, and sometimes around 3 a.m., they ring softly. Not wind. My windows are closed. Not my cat. I don't have a cat. Just a gentle tinkling that sounds almost curious, almost patient. My brother called yesterday, asking why I haven't responded to his messages. I told him I'm fine. I told him the hiking trip was great. I told him all the normal lies that normal people tell. What I didn't tell him is that I've been researching trail disappearances in the Pisgah National Forest. What I didn't tell him is that every missing person report I can find mentions, somewhere in the witness statements, that the person seemed distracted in their final days. Paranoid, talking about being watched. What I didn't tell him is that this morning, when I went to move my truck, I found 7 bundles arranged in a circle around it, all pointing inward. Tonight, I've strung bells across every window, every door. I've turned on every light in the apartment. I've pulled up every online forum I can find about unexplained phenomena in the Appalachians. reading through thread after thread of people describing markers, watchers, footsteps that don't match human cadence. Some of the threads end mid-sentence, others just stop updating. One, from 2 years ago, includes a photograph that makes my chest tight with recognition. Bundles arranged around a campsite, identical to mine. The poster's username was Trail Raven. Their last message, dated 3 days after the photo. They're at my house now. They're not trying to hide anymore. I think they're waiting for something. I think they're waiting for me to understand. No updates after that. It's 11:43 p.m. now. In 4 minutes, if the pattern holds, the bells will ring. They always do at 11:47. I've learned to expect it. What I haven't learned is what to do when they stop ringing. Because eventually, they will. Eventually, whatever leaves those markers will get tired of announcing itself. And then I'll learn what comes after the warning. The bells just rang. It's only 11:44. They're early tonight, and they're getting closer.